Chapter 468. There was a lot of mud on his rough fingers, and they were a bit wet after he rubbed his eyes. Su Li's lungs hurt. He did not know if it was because the bullets of the Imperium did not penetrate his hard bulletproof vest but broke his ribs. He also did not know if the wetness on his fingers was because of the pain or because of something else. The dry cigarette between his dry lips swayed softly in the night wind. Looking at the trembling cannons in the sky, he asked silently, "You should be calculating the massive data on the command starship, making suggestions and controlling the overall situation. But instead you came to chat with a lone ghost like me. Will anything go wrong? I'm everywhere. One of them stopped by your side and saved your life. Are you grateful?" The Federation Central Computer answered the question in a mechanical manner. The latter half of the sentence was boring. Su Li took off the burning cigarette. This inadvertent action cut off a piece of his lip. He frowned in pain and said angrily, "Go to hell." The silver light on the rocks was beautiful, and the night wind was cool. He sat on the rocks alone and watched the magnificent war like a spectator. It was hard for him to feel proud of himself for causing all this. Instead, he felt a bit lonely. Fortunately, there was a boring but interesting program chatting with him. A self-mocking smile appeared on his face. He sighed in his heart. "If you couldn't find me today, I would have been dead. I've always been curious. You should be deep underground in the Bureau of Proclamation. Even if the information passed through the mini twisting hole, it would take at least 2 to 3 minutes to reach you. How could you be so fast?" "I am not afraid of time," the old guy answered philosophically with the light talisman. "I am everywhere I can. Returning to this planet again, I feel that I am full of strength." Su Li had been used to the more and more nonsensical expressions of the supposedly cold central computer. He was never bothered by the state that he could not explain, so he did not feel scared or frustrated. On the contrary, he understood the answer easily. After a moment of silence, he said mockingly, "Won't you be schizophrenic if you have thousands of incarnations?" The fierce battle occupied every inch of land on the east side of the planet. Every second, soldiers fell and died, turning into mindless flesh and ashes. The battle was too intense. Su Li hid alone in the rocky peak until noon the next day. The federal military finally pulled out a combat helicopter and picked him up from the mountain. The loud roar of the helicopter covered the loud question of the pilot. The pale-faced Su Li was half leaning in the cabin full of the smell of engine oil, looking at the mountains and grassland below. The closer they got to the Federation base in the west, the more troops they saw on the ground. Looking down from the sky, countless torrents of steel occupied all the space in their field of vision. They were slowly but firmly pressing toward the territory controlled by the Empire. It was a magnificent sight. The helicopter stopped about 10 kilometers away from the rhombus-shaped base and immediately took off again to join the tense battle. At the airstrip, there were already military vehicles waiting for Su Li. The violently shaking military vehicle drove along the quick-solidifying cement military road toward the base. Along the way, Su Li saw many small troops like himself, moving against the torrent of large troops and converging toward the base. These small troops were like Group 7 special teams that carried out netlang work on the planet. Looking at the tanned and haggard faces of his comrades, Su Li quickly recognized that this included most of the combat teams of the 3 major security companies of the Federation. The combat experts of Whitewater, Blackhawk, and Bluebird seemed to have all gathered on this planet. Although these netlang teams retreated earlier than Group 7, in the end, under the crazy scattered attacks of the Empire, they still suffered heavy casualties. What shocked him was that among these combat teams carrying out dangerous missions, there were also many soldiers in ragged clothes. These soldiers had obviously risked their lives and worked in the Empire's territory for a long time, but they still maintained an upright state of mind. It was just that their firearms and equipment were obviously a bit outdated. His eyes fell on the tattered military uniforms of these soldiers and the somewhat painful formation of wounded soldiers. His eyes narrowed, and his right hand gripped the handle of the military vehicle tightly. The anti-government forces of Green Dragon Mountain had finally arrived. The military road was filled with the second wave of federal military forces. The Federation soldiers on the armored vehicles and mechas looked at these bumpkins of Green Dragon Mountain with complicated expressions. They knew very well that although these heavily injured troops were retreating toward the base, They were definitely not deserters. On the contrary, they were all warriors worthy of respect. It was just that a few years ago, both sides were sworn enemies, but today they were comrades in the trenches. For many people in the government forces, it was very difficult for them to adapt to this change. A shout came from who knew where. The soldiers of the main force slowly raised their right hand and saluted the mercenaries of the three major security companies and the anti-government forces of Green Dragon Mountain. At the same time, they cast looks of trust and gratitude. The military vehicle quickly drove to the front of the barracks. Sulu leaned on the 21-26 long sniper rifle and limped out of the military vehicle with difficulty. He smiled and said a few words to the soldier driving and patted the soldier's shoulder. A member of Group 7 who was the first to retreat in the early morning had been waiting outside the barracks all night. At this time, when he saw Sulu come out of the military vehicle, his face showed a trace of shock and ecstasy. He screamed and rushed into the barracks. "Boss is back." "Really?" A burst of exclamations and footsteps came from Group 7's barracks. Dozens of members rushed out of the barracks at the same time. Except for the members who were seriously injured and were receiving treatment, all of them rushed out to welcome Suli's return. Even Da Vinci, who was seriously injured in the leg, jumped out with crutches. Sulu grinned and looked at the members in front of him. He wanted to say a few words, but in the end he didn't say anything. He silently walked forward and handed the rifle to Magnolia. Then he took a whole pack of cigarettes from Lan Xiaolong and opened it. He dragged his injured and tired body and seriously gave cigarettes to each member. After a pack of cigarettes was finished, Song Zhenzi patted his head and quickly ran into the barracks to take half of the stock and handed it to him. Sulu continued to seriously give cigarettes to each member, and then lit them up. At the same time, he sincerely said in a hoarse voice, "You worked hard. You worked hard." Yesterday morning Lan Xiaolong had led the dozens of new members to retreat first, and their faces were filled with shame and unwillingness. As for the members who had followed Sulu to kill their way to the peak of the green-gray rock, their faces were filled with excitement and excitement. Then, Sulu walked to the somewhat familiar tree next to the barracks. He put 3 cigarettes between his lips and lit them up. He took 2 puffs and seriously inserted them into the loose soil under the tree. Bursts of smoke. There was a deathly silence. Many people's eyes were red. It was not necessarily sadness, but mixed with some kind of complicated emotion. On this planet, Group 7 had not lost a single person for more than 2 months. However, in the last mission before the Great Counterattack, they were ruthlessly slashed by the Imperium. In the riverbank and the subsequent retreat, more than 10 of their brothers fell into eternal slumber. In this deathly silent atmosphere, some new members could not help but cry. Immediately, they were fiercely yelled back by their companions. The team members fiercely smoked one cigarette after another, like burning paper rolls between their lips. This was the life of the Empire people. The entire barracks was shrouded in silence and the pungent smell of 37 brand cigarettes. Da Vinci smoked the most fiercely. He silently squatted under the eaves of the barracks. He thought of the big guy who lived in the same room, the farmer's son. He thought of the helmet sprayed with blood on the riverbank. He thought of not being able to smell the smell of that guy's feet in the future. His eyes had long since turned red. There was a hint of viciousness in the scarlet red that was hard to describe. At this time, the camera crew of the Venus documentary film studio of the Ministry of National Defense quietly appeared in the barracks. The buzzing sound of the equipment operating woke up the team members who were immersed in the sad atmosphere. There were only 2 people in the camera crew. Yesterday, they withdrew halfway through the mission, so they did not film the fierce battle on the riverbank. At this time, of course, they did not want to miss the scene that was enough to move all the people of the Federation. "Stop filming." Sulu stood up with the help of a tree trunk. He glanced at his left arm that was bleeding and said to the cameraman. The cameraman hesitated and looked at the host next to him. "Fuck, I told you to stop filming." Da Vinci stared with his bloodshot eyes and rushed over like a tiger. He kicked the cameraman away, grabbed the camera, and slammed it on the ground, shattering it into pieces. Sulu lowered his head and waved his hand. Lan Xiaolong and Xiong Linquan rushed up and blocked Da Vinci behind them. Bai Yulan used her sharp and cold eyes to force the cameraman and the host out of the barracks. The doctor, Ho Xiandong, shook his head and gave Da Vinci a sedative injection. As veterans of Group 7, they had all experienced the emotions of these rookies when they first encountered life and death. At this time, looking at Da Vinci, who was gradually relaxing and sleeping in their arms, they also felt depressed. The military camp prohibited alcohol and cigarettes. In the face of a life and death situation, soldiers all needed the stimulation of cigarettes. In the legends of the military camp, there was naturally a reference to this. That was a fire. A fire was a reference to when a soldier woke up early in the morning and went to the toilet. Then, he would light up one cigarette after another and smoke until he went to sleep. In the first 3 days after the mission, Su Lu and many people in Group 7 lived a life that was similar to a fire. The laughter of their dead comrades, the exhaustion after the fierce battle, and the trembling of surviving a disaster could only be slightly relieved by the company of cigarettes. Su Lu also hid a fire in his heart. If it wasn't for the stupid mistake made by the Bureau of Proclamation, Group 7 wouldn't have had to take that last risk. Those men would have been happily chatting in the barracks and smoking like him. Su Lu knew his weakness. If he couldn't avenge his comrades who didn't deserve to die, the fire in his heart would never be extinguished. It would only burn more and more fiercely. However, the opponent was the mysterious and indifferent Bureau of Proclamation. Before he had time to write a report to the Ministry of Defense, the Bureau of Proclamation had found him first. Chapter 469. During the mission to repair the base, Su Lu knew that his actions had violated many military rules. For example, disobeying military orders was a serious offense. Especially when he forcibly went through the underground tunnel to communicate with the base at the end, it was a very serious offense. However, it had been 3 days since he returned to the military camp. The white ash from the cigarette was spread 3 feet under his feet, but the higher-ups of the military did not say anything. He thought that the mission was successfully completed. The higher-ups glanced at the mountains behind him, and were ready to leave the matter unsettled. Who would have thought that there was actually a secret investigation targeting him? Interesting. Su Lu began to pack his luggage with a calm expression. He followed the officer from the Bureau of Proclamation and walked out of the barracks. The military vehicle was waiting for him at the gate. The members of Group 7 who had just received the news immediately went into a frenzy. They wore their hats askew, wore military shoes, and had cigarettes in their mouths. They looked like gangsters from Bermuda. They grabbed all kinds of guns and rushed out of the barracks, blocking the military vehicle that was just about to leave. Looking at the black muzzles, the faces of the officers from the Bureau of Proclamation, and the military police in the vehicle became extremely ugly. They tried to intimidate them with military rules, but it was to no avail. The members stared at these people with eyes that were about to spit out fire. Although not everyone knew the truth of the last mission, they knew what kind of price Group 7 had paid, and how much risk their leader had taken to successfully complete the mission. But in the end, these fucking higher-ups still wanted to investigate. Su Lu looked at Bai Yulan through the glass. Bai Yulan understood what he meant. She threw the cigarette butt on the ground and stepped on it to extinguish it. She said to the members blocking the gate in a deep voice, "Are you crazy? Put down your guns." The members looked at each other and slowly put down their guns. However, they still stared at the people in the military vehicle with cold and ruthless expressions. It seemed that if the officers from the Bureau of Proclamation did not immediately let Su Lu out, countless bullets would be fired at the vehicle in the next moment. The dark glass slowly fell down. Su Lu looked at these people and said, "Disperse. I'll be back in 2 days." Among the new and old members of Group 7, Bai Yulan was the one they had the most interaction with. They were also most in awe of this seemingly unparalleled beauty, but in reality, she was a ruthless and cunning veteran. On the contrary, in the past few months of military life, Su Lu did not spend a lot of time with his team members. He spent most of his time buried in his office and rarely worried about the cruel training and the bustling life. He was not like an excellent general who would undress and push food to maintain his authority and degree of respect in the team. What was amazing was that once Su Lu spoke, no one in Group 7 dared to disobey him. This was because he had perfectly fulfilled his promise before the battle. As the saying went, charge at the front, retreat at the back. I'll be the scapegoat, but I'll still be the one to face the mountain of knives. He didn't say much, but he did a lot. A commander like this was like a big rock under their buttocks. It was very easy for his team members to feel at ease and trust him completely. So at this time, when Sulu asked everyone to disperse, although the members of Group 7 were very unwilling, they still quickly dispersed and made way for the military vehicle to move forward. Then they fiercely spat countless mouthfuls of thick spittle in the direction of the fleeing military vehicle. Staff Officer Ning, I want to see Deputy Commander E. I don't understand why that officer clearly violated so many military rules, but the command center is still unwilling to come up with specific punishment measures. In my opinion, a rogue officer like this who has no regard for military rules should be removed from our team. Deputy Director Bai of the Bureau of Proclamation adjusted the square glasses on the bridge of her nose. A trace of coldness flashed across her poker face. Her angry voice sounded particularly rigid. Ning He glanced at her and calmly and politely said, Director Bai, the commander has been in command for 3 consecutive days and is now resting. As for the matter you mentioned, the commander has said that since the Bureau of Proclamation is strongly requesting to investigate this matter, then please investigate thoroughly first before the military takes over. Deputy Director Bai was stunned, thinking of the infuriating officer in the room and the command center that had always maintained a strange attitude. A trace of anger appeared between her brows. She coldly snorted and turned to leave. Ning He watched her disappear into the corridor, and the smile on his face disappeared. He gently knocked on the door and walked into the room. He said to the general beside the wide porthole in a deep voice, The Bureau of Proclamation's investigation seems to have made no progress. Deputy Director Bai is here again to request for a military discipline review. As a former member of Group 7, Ning He naturally couldn't bear to see Sulu and Group 7 being humiliated and investigated. Although he knew that Sulu and Group 7 had outstanding backgrounds, this investigation was conducted by the Bureau of Proclamation. He was only a mid-rank staff officer and couldn't do more. Deputy Commander E slowly turned around with no expression on his face. As one of the big shots in the military, he didn't need to care about this investigation at all. However, since it involved Sulu and Group 7, he had been maintaining a calm attitude and watching the show. Punishment by military law? The general's face was full of ridicule. Not to mention that Sulu and Group 7 had completed their mission beautifully. Even if there really was a problem, would there really be anyone in the military who dared to conduct an internal investigation on their own? Deputy Commander E was a little angry at the thought of the fierce battle still going on the planet, and the Bureau of Proclamation couldn't wait to capture their officers back to the warship. But the Bureau of Proclamation's position in the Federation was too high, so he couldn't stop it. After a moment of silence, Deputy Commander E opened his mouth and said, Keep an eye on the situation in the interrogation room. We must ensure the personal safety of Lieutenant Colonel Sulu. What if a conflict arises? Ning He asked. Deputy Commander E said with slight ridicule, Of course we'll snatch him and send him back to the capital. Are we going to let him eat with the poker faces of the Bureau of Proclamation? On the other side was the Bureau of Proclamation, but behind Sulu was the entire federal military. If both sides were said to be the most powerful thugs in the Federation, then at the end of the line, the thug with the gun would ultimately be more vicious. In the quiet interrogation room, an officer from the Bureau of Proclamation was recording with his head down. Sulu lowered his head and slowly sipped on his coffee. The investigation team didn't take any coercive measures against him, and they even provided him with delicious coffee. However, after answering countless questions in the past hour, even someone as stoic as him began to feel irritated. The Bureau of Proclamation's investigation was in an awkward situation. Whether it was Sulu obeying the military order, forcibly opening the communication channel, or something else, this was a matter of military discipline. However, at this moment, the frontline command was not willing to interfere with this investigation at all. Therefore, no matter how Sulu answered, the Bureau of Proclamation couldn't come to the conclusion they needed. The door was pushed open, and Deputy Director Bai walked in with a sullen face. He slammed the table in front of Sulu and reprimanded him with a sharp and rigid voice. You continuously disobeyed military orders. Do you know that at every step you may have caused irreparable losses? Sulu put down his coffee cup, lowered his head and answered in a hoarse voice, But the fact is that I succeeded. I didn't cause any losses. Have a proper attitude. Raise your head. Deputy Director Bai reprimanded him angrily. Sulu didn't raise his head. Instead, he picked up his coffee cup again and took a tasteless sip. I know that you are Minister Zhou's future son-in-law, a reserve military officer that the war god has focused on training. After a moment of silence, Deputy Director Bai said, I know that you have a powerful background, a powerful backer. I, and all the staff in the bureau, respect the war god and Minister Zhou very much. The female official's voice was sharp and sarcastic again. But you have to understand that this is an investigation by the Bureau of Proclamation. I am already being very polite to you because of some important people. Otherwise, I would have already arrested you and all your useless team members a long time ago. Hearing the words useless team members, Sulu suddenly raised his head and stared into the woman's eyes. He knew very well the position of the Bureau of Proclamation in the Federation. If he really offended them, the Bureau of Proclamation didn't need to give face to the military. However, the mockery and contempt in the woman's words towards his team members was something that he couldn't accept. He finally understood why the Bureau of Proclamation officials did not care about the attitude of the Department of Defense in Philadelphia, and why they wanted him on the warship to help with the investigation. An ordinary officer of the Federation had the ability to activate the surveillance network before the Bureau of Proclamation team. This was definitely something that would shock the Bureau of Proclamation. He pondered in silence for a long time, and found that some of the things that he wanted to keep in his mind could not be hidden in the bottom layer of his hard drive forever like porn movies. My name is Sulu. You should have my citizen ID. I suggest you check the authority given to me by the charter. He looked at Deputy Director Bai and said calmly, like the director of the Bureau of Proclamation giving orders to his subordinates. After you check it, remember to keep it strictly confidential. Only the two of you know my authority level. If the Bureau of Proclamation has any internal investigation, I allow you to report it to Director Bai. Deputy Director Bai definitely did not understand this sentence. She looked at him coldly, as if she was looking at a crazy person. But then a muffled sound came from behind her. The Bureau of Proclamation official in charge of recording fell to the ground heavily. Out of curiosity, the Bureau of Proclamation official really checked the charter authority of Citizen Sulu. The official was shocked by the level that appeared on the light screen and lost his ability to move. Deputy Director Bai walked to the workbench uneasily. She took off her glasses and looked at the light screen. Her right hand trembled, and she could no longer hold the legs of the glasses. Chapter 470. Deputy Director Bai had a square and old-fashioned face, and her life was also very square and old-fashioned. However, when she saw the authorization number on the screen today, she suddenly thought of herself before she entered the Bureau of Proclamation. She was in the prime of her life in the Department of Mathematics of Capital University, guiding stars and lamenting about her life. She also thought of the poem that was engraved in her heart during her youth. A black flower bloomed on a pale mountain. The petals were engraved with years of dust to show the ruthless time. Time flowed in the woman's eyes. With a blink of her eyes, she shattered the forever pale cliff. It was very inexplicable and indescribable. However, at this moment she remembered this poem that had nothing to do with the current situation. Her gloomy and angry square face suddenly became as pale as the cliff in the poem, as cold as the great computer in the underground of the building. Her heart, which believed in order and rules, could no longer be controlled and beat violently. Her whole body was cold as she realized that the years had passed, and the black flowers were covered in dust. Things in this world were already like the ignorant little poem, which was too abstract and absurd. The first order of authorization? What was the level of authorization of President Pabre? What was the level of authorization of Director Pai and Assistant Chui? What was the level of authorization of military god Li Pifu? This was not a routine internal examination of the Bureau of Proclamation, and the level here was not the stairs of the Bureau of Proclamation building. It represented power that was more dazzling than the stars. This matter is confidential. Sulu silently requested the Federation Central Computer to seal his authority level as he spoke to the two officials in the room, who were so shocked that their faces were about to become paralyzed. The uncle gave him the burning and sour magical power in his body. The Federal Central Computer gave him the high-level authorization. His body was about to become a powerful machine. He chatted with the old man like a friend in the charter square. He faced the dazzling sun directly. A lot of things that happened to him made him feel ridiculous. He felt that he was a monster. Therefore, in his daily life, he contacted the old man less and less, and he did not want people to be able to touch the edge of his monster. If it were not for the sharp investigation of the Bureau of Proclamation, which could not explain the activation of the entire Planet 163 network, he certainly did not want the Bureau of Proclamation to know his authorization level. His temperament did not like to play low-key glamour, pretending to be some kind of docile animal to bite a seemingly majestic beast. It was only for the aforementioned reasons that he needed the Bureau of Proclamation to keep his identity a secret. Following his request, or rather order, the light screen of the Bureau of Proclamation's workbench on the table quickly turned dark. From this moment on, it would be very difficult for anyone to check his level of authority. This scene shocked Associate Chief Physician Bai, who had not done anything, and the official who was crawling up from the ground. After the initial shock, most of their natural suspicion disappeared. "Can I go now?" Sulu asked, but he felt that he still had some things to do. Deputy Director Bai wanted to adjust his glasses to dispel the shock in his heart, but he found that he was holding nothing. He nodded subconsciously. Seeing Sulu leave without looking back, she quickly said to her subordinates with a pale face and hurried to catch up with his footsteps. Her slightly high imitation leather shoes stepped on the broken glasses on the ground, making a clattering sound. Outside the quiet interrogation room was a long corridor with a metallic luster. At the end of the corridor was the busy but not noisy command hall. On the right side was a scanning channel. At the end of the branch channel was the Joint Data Processing Center of the Bureau of Proclamation and the Command Center. The center was responsible for all the data feedback of the monitoring network of the planet below the battleship, as well as the complex tactical deduction conclusions made by the Federal Central Computer to the Command Center for reference. It was very important. Suli's body paused for a second. He suddenly remembered what he was going to do. He turned around and walked towards the quiet and serious room. 3 light blue waves of light shot out from the scanning door and scanned his body. The door opened with a beep. Deputy Director Bai, who was following closely behind him, changed her expression again. She knew better than anyone else the level of authority required to enter the data center. Even the high-ranking officers in the headquarters needed temporary authorization from the Constitutional Bureau. However, the lieutenant colonel in front of her walked in boldly and decisively. What this meant was already very clear. The triple door opened. Sulu walked into the room. Looking at the busy officers and the indifferent black-clothed officers of the Bureau of Proclamation, he directly asked, "Who is in charge of the processing of the G2337 base point?" Inside the room, countless high-performance computers were performing parallel calculations. The air was filled with an indescribable smell, as if countless pots of cactus were mutilating themselves at the same time, releasing a faint but sharp smell. The officers of the Bureau of Proclamation were commanding the officers to perform the operation. The quiet environment was instantly destroyed by Suli's question. His question was not rude, but it was too concise and direct. So in the ears of these high-ranking officers of the Bureau of Proclamation, it sounded a bit sharp and rude. "Get out!" A middle-aged officer of the Bureau of Proclamation wearing glasses scolded him with a dark face. Since this young officer was able to enter the room, he was naturally granted temporary authority. However, this officer's mood had been somewhat depressed and indignant for the past few days. Especially when he heard the serial number of that base point, his mood was extremely bad. After returning to the Bureau, he still had to write an inspection report, and he might even be demoted and have his pay cut, just because of a small mistake. The Bureau had not done such a large-scale project for many years. He had no experience at all. Was he to be blamed? The officers of the Bureau of Proclamation in the room glanced at Sulu and shook their heads. They wondered what kind of medicine this officer had taken. He dared to mention the thing that old Nyo did not want to mention the most in front of him. No wonder old Nyo's attitude was so bad. No one paid attention to Sulu. He stood alone at the door. After a moment of silence, he suddenly turned to Deputy Director Bai and asked, "I want to know who is in charge of the G2337 base point." At this time, the people in the room saw clearly that their immediate superior, Deputy Director Bai, was following behind this officer. They all stood up in shock, not knowing what had happened. Deputy Director Bai had a strong premonition that if he said it, something very bad might happen. But facing Su Li's persistent and firm eyes, and thinking of this officer's shocking level of authority, he hesitated for a moment and finally said in a hoarse voice, "Nyo Delu?" "Who is Nyo Delu?" Su Lu turned to look at the officers of the Bureau of Proclamation and asked. No one answered him, but he followed their gazes and narrowed his eyes. He stared at the middle-aged officer not far in front of him. It was this officer who had angrily yelled at him to get out. "I am in charge of that base point." Nyo Delu looked at the young officer in front of him. His thoughts were slightly chaotic because of the arrival of Deputy Director Bai, but his voice still showed the unique coldness of the officers of the Bureau of Proclamation. "What's wrong? What's the matter? If there's nothing, then hurry up and leave. I'm not in the mood to talk about this nonsense right now." Su Lu looked at the face full of indifference in front of him without blinking. It was as if he wanted to remember every detail of this face. He was a Federation officer. Even if he had many opinions about that stupid Bureau of Proclamation official, he only wanted to follow the established procedures and report to his superiors. When he walked into the data center, he only wanted to see which stupid bastard had killed so many of his brothers. He didn't plan to do anything directly, but now that he looked at this official's face, he knew that he was wrong. The Bureau of Proclamation was the Bureau of Proclamation. The officials under the protection of the Great Radiance did not care at all how many Federation soldiers their mistakes would kill. There was no regret, sorrow, or guilt in their hearts. On the contrary, they were angry at the loss of face brought by their own small mistakes. So, the heat from the countless cigarettes that had been lit for several days finally began to boil in his chest. It burned his heart until it became hotter and hotter, and his narrowed eyes became brighter and brighter. "Are you a pig? How could you make a mistake with a technical manual?" He looked into Nyo Delu's eyes and said with an indifferent tone, "The Federation spends so much money to support people like you. Can't you be a bit more professional?" The room was silent. The Bureau of Proclamation officials and officers looked at this person who suddenly appeared and the anger they could not understand. "What did you say?" Nyo Delu's eyes widened in disbelief. He was about to sneer out of anger. Su Lu ignored him and said, "We are soldiers. It is our duty to obey orders. My team members have never been afraid of death, but we should not pay such a terrible price for your stupidity. Do you know how many people have died because of your stupidity? You are Su Lu from Group 7? Nyo Delu finally reacted. His expression changed slightly, and then he said in a furious and angry voice, "This is a standard error. It is the allowable error in the manual. What is a soldier like you know? You are under investigation. What right do you have to question me?" Deputy Director Bai felt that the situation was about to get out of control. He hurriedly walked behind Su Lu and said uneasily, "Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, we have sent the relevant report back to the Bureau. There will definitely be a solution that you will be satisfied with. I believe that the Bureau will definitely inform you and your unit at the first moment." Nyo Delu and the officials of the Charter Bureau, who had also begun to feel indignant, looked at their superior in astonishment. They thought to themselves, "These days, you were the one who was angry at this officer for not following military discipline and his undisciplined behavior, and strongly demanded an investigation. Why did you suddenly change your mind?" "I originally only wanted to report to the Ministry of Defense and complain about Xiao He, but now I suddenly understand. Your Bureau of Proclamation is used to being the biggest in the world. How will this officer be dealt with? Write a sincere self-criticism, or be sent to a mineral planet to check the equipment for 2 or 3 months?" Su Lu said calmly with no fluctuation in his voice, "But many of my people have died." After saying this, he fell silent. His fist, which was as hard as a rock, moved and smashed viciously in front of him. The fist smashed into the face of the Bureau of Proclamation official, sending another pair of glasses flying. A stream of blood flew angrily onto the roof. The man fell to the ground with a heavy thud. Then he kicked heavily again. The clear sound of bones breaking echoed cruelly in the quiet room. No one knew how many of the Bureau of Proclamation officials' ribs were broken. Chapter 471. Although Sulu expressed his anger through his sarcastic, mocking and vulgar words, his expression remained as calm as a rock. No one would have thought that, without any warning, he would suddenly attack. He knocked Nyo Delu to the ground like a madman, and then stomped on him countless times with his military boots so that he could not turn around. Su Li's fists and feet were like mechanical arms with rigid springs installed. They came crashing down with a whoosh, as calm as hitting a sandbag during training. The storm-like fists and feet attacked Nyo Delu until blood flowed out from his face. His bones and flesh cracked. The scene looked extremely cruel. Nyo Delu howled miserably. His terrified and shrill voice filled the data center. However, he only cried for less than 3 seconds before he fainted. Shock, bewilderment, fear and anger. Countless complicated expressions appeared on the faces of the officials of the Bureau of Proclamation. Everything happened too fast. So fast that they could not react at all. Their colleague was already beaten beyond recognition. Even the officials who reacted faster were intimidated by Su Li's crazy attacks. And the cold calmness that was the complete opposite of the crazy. They felt cold all over and did not dare to move forward. It was not until Nyo Delu fainted and Sulu gradually straightened his slightly bowed body that the officials in the data center began to shout angrily. They were used to being accompanied by the data, regulations and logic of the Bureau of Proclamation. When faced with this inconceivably savage and violent scene, they naturally did not dare to move forward. They could only angrily order the officers in the room to attack. The reaction of the Federation officers was not fast enough. They were soldiers and naturally stood on the side of Sulu and Group 7. In addition, they knew very well what kind of price the Bureau of Proclamation officers had to pay for the stupid mistakes of their comrades, so they were not willing to interfere at all. On the contrary, when they saw Sulu beat up the Bureau of Proclamation officer, they felt some indescribable excitement and comfort in their hearts. But after all, this was a time of war. This was a glorious command ship. The officers could not just stand by and watch Sulu beat Nyo Delu to death. At such a time, an active military officer killed an official of the Bureau of Proclamation in broad daylight. No matter how strong his background was, it was impossible for him to escape the punishment of military discipline and imprisonment. Nyo Delu was unconscious on the ground. The officers walked forward and blocked in front of Sulu, at the same time calling for the warship's medics to come and save the wounded. Associate Chief Physician Bai narrowed his eyes and watched as Sulu straightened his slightly hunched body. He was so angry that his entire body trembled, and he clenched his fists tightly. She wasn't imitating Su Li's unique expression when he was angry or nervous. Instead, her glasses had been shattered into pieces, and her myopia made her vision a little blurry. If she didn't squint her eyes, she wouldn't be able to see what was happening in front of her. Su Li's merciless and fierce attacks on his subordinates and the blood on the ground still pierced through her eyes and pierced her heart. The pride and dignity of the Bureau of Proclamation temporarily overcame the confusion, doubt, and fear of Su Li's authority. She looked at Su Li's blood-stained right hand and said angrily, "Are you satisfied now?" Sulu didn't turn his head. His tense body rose and fell slightly under his dark military uniform. He wasn't panting because he was tired, but because his emotions were fluctuating. "Yes, I'm satisfied." These 2 lines of dialogue seemed to have a strange style unique to Schiller's absurd comedies, but everyone in the room knew that this was not a comedy, but a tragedy, a play that no one dared to guess the outcome of. The officers blocked in front of Sulu because they didn't want him to really kill Nyo Delu, but they couldn't really arrest him either. They were just a little worried. The glory of the Charter had protected the Federation for countless years. The Bureau of Proclamation was an extremely special organization in the Federation. The government and the parliament couldn't order the building at the end of the road around. Even the successive presidents and the war godly Pifu had to give the Bureau of Proclamation due respect. More importantly, the Bureau of Proclamation's authority and the unspeakable connection it had with the chips on the back of the people's necks made everyone subconsciously fear or forcibly forget the existence of the Bureau of Proclamation. Once they met, even the 7 great families had to temporarily avoid them. The people in the room had never seen or heard of anyone. In fact, no one in the Federation had ever heard of anyone like Sulu, challenging the Bureau of Proclamation's position in such a bloody way, humiliating the Bureau of Proclamation's glory in such a violent way. You dare violate the first charter. Niu Delu was carried out of the room by the medics. The people in the room calmed down a little, but it wasn't because they were calm. Instead, they began to have time to think about the next problem. A delicate and pretty female official of the Bureau of Proclamation stared at Su Lu and said those words with an incredulous tone, as if she had naturally sentenced him to death. The officers looked silently and worriedly at Su Lu. They thought to themselves, even if you have the Lees of Philadelphia and the Department of Defense behind you, who can save you after violating the first charter? After all, you're still not the new war god of the Federation. From the time of the catastrophe until now, in countless years, no one had been able to challenge the Bureau of Proclamation and win. In fact, basically no one had ever dared to challenge the Bureau of Proclamation. But Sulu happened to know a certain person who had once done such a thing in a carefree and unrestrained manner. Moreover, he could drink red wine and eat beef by the mines and visit prostitutes in the sanatorium in his spare time. Enjoying life. Sulu was an uncle type of person. He had brothers, friends, beautiful girls, and comrades. He was very satisfied with days like this, so he wasn't prepared to abandon everything for no reason and rebel against the glory of the Charter. But in his opinion, the glory of the Charter and the Bureau of Proclamation were two completely different things. The Bureau of Proclamation was, after all, just a secret organization that served the central computer. He had bathed in that light countless times and chatted and joked with that existence. How could a person who had swum the sea be afraid of crossing a small ditch? His mentality was different. He couldn't be like the average person who revered the Bureau of Proclamation. When he heard the beautiful female official say those words, he was not afraid. He just silently put on his military cap and raised his blood-stained middle finger to the ceiling of the warship that glowed with a metallic luster, as if he was facing the radiance of the Charter that enveloped countless galaxies, and said, "I'm not afraid. Fuck the first Charter." This young officer was crazy. Whether it was the officials of the Bureau of Proclamation or the soldiers who were emotionally inclined towards Sulu, their expressions became extremely ugly. The same thought appeared in their minds. But Sulu wasn't done yet. He continued to raise his indecent middle finger and said to the row of high-end computing terminals and the wide holographic screen by the wall, "Old thing, this is for you." Hearing the words "old thing," the expressions of Deputy Director Bai and the officials of the Bureau of Proclamation changed slightly. They had worked in the Bureau of Proclamation building for many years, so they were very sensitive to these seemingly ordinary words. But when these words came from Suli's mouth, they were even more shocked. The military police finally arrived. They were armed with live ammunition and made a pleased gesture to Sulu. Although they didn't use high-strength plastic ropes, it still represented some kind of mandatory requirement. Sulu walked out under escort. At this moment, a line of white light flashed in his left eye. It was the Federal Central Computer's fastest and most innocent reaction to his middle finger. "What does this have to do with me?" Seeing the old thing's answer, he couldn't help but laugh bitterly at himself. But before he walked out of the door, he stopped and looked back at the people in the room. The officials of the Bureau of Proclamation suddenly became nervous when he turned around. They didn't know if this crazy man would jump up and hit them again. The military police who came under orders subconsciously raised their guns slightly. "What's the name of the curly-haired official in our group?" He looked at Deputy Director Bai and asked. Deputy Director Bai was stunned. He said a name, narrowed his eyes and said coldly, "Why do you ask this? He's already dead. Do you want him to take responsibility? He died with us on a mission, so I have to know his name. His name will appear in the sacrifice list of the 7th group." After Sulu finished this sentence, he saluted Deputy Director Bai and left. During the battle, a Bureau of Proclamation official was beaten to the brink of being crippled. Countless people witnessed this violent scene with their own eyes. Even if the federal military wanted to find a way out for Sulu, they couldn't bear the anger of the Bureau of Proclamation and leave the matter unsettled. On one hand, the frontline command reported this matter to the Ministry of National Defense as quickly as possible. On the other hand, they had no choice but to issue disciplinary measures to Sulu. At the same time, they anxiously waited for the attitude of the Bureau of Proclamation in the capital ring. Suli's military punishment was to be confined until the Bureau of Proclamation made a decision. This seemed to be a very harsh method, but he didn't care. After all, after killing Macklin, he was imprisoned in the Fox Fortress for a few months, but he still survived. At most he would let the old guy make a few more movies to watch. He could face all of this calmly, but the members of the 7th group couldn't. Lieutenant Colonel Sulu wanted to seek justice for them and their dead comrades, so he beat up an official of the Bureau of Proclamation. As a result, he was confined by his superiors. For a time the entire barracks was filled with the sound of guns being loaded. Other than that, the camp was deathly silent. But for some reason, the other groups that passed by the barracks felt that there were countless roaring beasts hiding inside, ready to rush out at any moment. Bai Yulan, who looked docile on the surface but was actually sharp and bloodthirsty, could intimidate these men, but she remained silent. On the surface she was full of sarcasm, but in reality, the smooth and cunning Lan Xiaolong also remained silent. From a certain perspective, they were even allowing the members of the 7th group to brew up this violent emotion. This was because Bai Yulan and Lan Xiaolong knew very well what Su Li's actions meant, and what it meant to offend the Bureau of Proclamation. If they didn't cause a big commotion, they were afraid that the small-eyed man they were determined to follow would really be in big trouble. The abnormal emotions in this ordinary barracks finally broke through the atmosphere and reached the Federal Fleet among the stars. The Federal Military 163 Frontline Command Center finally made an exception and made some kind of response after a long time of deliberation. The next day, a light battleship landed in the rhombus-shaped base. Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, who was temporarily stripped of his military position, was escorted back to the 7th Group barracks. An additional military police was sent to the barracks, but he was still confined but in a different place. They still had to wait for the reaction from the capital ring. Chapter 472. 3 moons climbed up and shone on the wild vegetables in Little Sister's basket. 3 moons fell and ate up the wild vegetables Little Sister made. 3 moons disappeared, Little Sister also disappeared. 3 moons rose, Little Sister, when will you come back? In the night sky, 3 moons of varying sizes shone on the quiet barracks and played a bright silver light on the continuous roof. A few hoarse voices softly hummed a simple ballad, providing a discordant accompaniment to this beautiful night scene. This was a Westwoods ballad, about the lives of the Federation citizens who were lost on Planet 163 after it was occupied by the Imperial Expeditionary Force a few decades ago. The Federation Society had deliberately forgotten about the 3 fallen planets, including this planet, but the natives of the Westwoods region could not forget. This song had spread far and wide. Although there were no members of Group 7 who were originally from the Westwoods, after being on the front line for a long time, everyone could sing this song. Sulu sat on a green bench behind the door, a cigarette in his mouth as he looked up at the moon in the sky. The astronomical phenomenon of 3 moons existing together was said to continue for 46 days. How many more days would he have to be locked up? I say, boss, how is the singing? You have to give me an opinion. Xiong Linquan asked in a hoarse voice. The diamond-shaped base was set up on a plateau. Although the sea was not too high, the air was particularly dry. In addition, these soldiers were used to smoking without leaving their lips, so their voices were rougher than usual, and their lips were full of thin cracks. Well, to be honest, it's not that great, Sulu, who was sitting behind the door, said with a smile. He knew very well that these guys were afraid that he would be too bored in the confinement, so they found a way to accompany him to pass the time. Group 7, who was originally extremely angry and ready to roar at any moment, had already calmed down. Because of what happened next, they could not find any reason or excuse to fly into a rage. The Federal Military Command noticed the strange phenomenon in the barracks and made a very wise decision to transfer Sulu from the warship to the ground and lock him up in Group 7's barracks. Was this still considered confinement? Other than not being able to walk out of the room freely, there was no problem with his life. Of course, there were 2 more statue-like gendarmes outside the door. Over the past few days, Sulu had been staying in his room obediently and did not cross the line at all. It was just that he had yet to receive any specific punishment from the capital ring. Whether he was officially arrested, brought back for trial, or directly locked up in the military prison of Qingcheng, no matter how bad the result was, it was still better than waiting for the worst result. In these boring days, he often moved a bench to sit by the door, enjoying the cigarettes that the team members handed him with flattering expressions, chatting with them, listening to them sing terrible songs, telling good jokes and then laughing. He felt as if he had returned to Donglin and had become an old, unemployed miner. He sat silently by the side of the street and watched the children play. His face was filled with the marks of time in the mines, and his face was filled with wrinkles that were as tough as iron. Just like the 7 groups of small folk music concerts in the middle of the night, the sun was dazzling, the air was dry, and the smoke was pungent. Sulu threw away the remaining half of the cigarette in his hand, pursed his cracked lips, and suspiciously took the miniature data storage box from Lan Xiaolong's hand that reached in through the door. He connected it to his phone. Looking at the images that appeared on the screen, he could not help but frown. The gendarmes guarding the door without any expression finally frowned. These days they were really tired from the various activities of Group 7. At this time, seeing that the other party seemed to be violating the confinement regulations and was secretly transmitting information, they finally could not help but want to stop it. At this time, Magnolia, who was leaning against the wall in a traditional posture with her head lowered, suddenly raised her head and glanced at the 2 gendarmes. Her gaze was as cold as a knife drawn from ice. The 2 gendarmes looked at each other and stood back to their original positions. Sulu turned off the images on the screen of his phone and looked at Lan Xiaolong angrily. "You think that when a person is bored they should watch porn?" Lan Xiaolong shrugged and said matter-of-factly, "Are boring literary films better to pass the time?" Sulu was too lazy to pay attention to him. He thought to himself that if he wanted to watch porn, he could just ask the old man to send a few over and directly see the 3-dimensional effect in his mind. What kind of enjoyment was that? At this moment, he saw a soldier wearing the military uniform of an armored division peeking in from the front door of the barracks. He chatted with the members of Group 7 who were guarding the door in a low voice for a while. Then, he took one last look at the room where Sulu was locked up and left reluctantly. Sulu laughed. These days, the number of troops that often passed by the barracks of Group 7 had suddenly increased. They used all kinds of reasons and methods to stay at the door for a while longer. They curiously looked at the members of Group 7 and their director, who was already very famous and now even more famous, as if they were looking at gods. The soldiers in the base found out about the conflict between the Constitutional Bureau and Group 7 through various channels. If this kind of roar between an elephant and an ant could be considered a conflict, then there was no conflict. The explosive news of Sulu beating up an official of the Bureau of Proclamation on the warship had already spread throughout the base. The soldiers of the Federation, who had always disliked the Bureau of Proclamation but were still afraid of them, and the net-laying teams that had just retreated from the mountains all secretly applauded this matter. While they were rubbing their palms, they also began to worry about the fate of Sulu and Group 7. Now that there were suddenly so many people passing by, other than curiosity and excitement, it was actually the grassroots soldiers using their own methods to express some kind of powerless but particularly interesting support. "Can you let us talk to the boss alone for a while? We don't have anything else to say, we just want to have a quiet chat." Bai Yulan withdrew her right leg from the wall and took out a pack of cigarettes from the pocket of her military uniform. She gave 2 cigarettes to the 2 military policemen responsible for guarding Sulu, and then gently patted their shoulders. She looked at their slightly young faces and spoke softly. "This is not in accordance with the rules," one of the military policemen replied with some hesitation. "You should be very clear about our boss's personality these past few days. He won't run. Of course, if he wants to run, you definitely won't be able to stop him." Bai Yulan lit the cigarettes for them. The military policemen held the lit cigarettes as if they were holding a red-hot iron bar. Their expressions were abnormally nervous. Although the other party did not threaten them, they still felt a little uneasy when they saw the men fiddling with the chain magazines under the tree not far away. More importantly, the higher-ups of the military used this kind of childish method to imprison Lieutenant Colonel Sulu, which already represented a certain attitude. After a moment of silence, the military policeman who had been like a statue for the past few days finally loosened his body and resentfully left the door. He was warmly and happily welcomed by Gu Shifeng and the other team members into the room next door. Then there was the sound of beer being opened in the room. Sulu sat inside the door and looked at Bai Yulan's glowing face under the scorching sun outside the door. He quietly waited for her to speak. Right now, a lot of people in the base are saying that Lieutenant Colonel Sulu is a dog that bites without barking. Bai Yulan smiled and said, "Of course, it's a compliment." "I didn't hear it," Sulu replied. He knew that the soldiers in the base probably thought of his quiet and somewhat wooden personality and his sudden outburst of events. After a moment of silence, he said thoughtfully, "Actually, I haven't always been this quiet. When I was young, I actually often said some sharp and unkind words. I wasn't any worse than Lan Xiaolong." At this moment, Lan Xiaolong was much quieter than usual. When he heard this sentence, he only shrugged to express his disdain. Bai Yulan thought to herself, "Your youth has always been a mystery. For so long, no one in Group 7 knew about it. Later, I realized that fists are more powerful than words, so now I'm not willing to say anything. I'm only willing to use my fists. I understand, but when I heard that you beat up an official from the Bureau of Proclamation on the battleship, I was still a little shocked." Bai Yulan lowered her eyes slightly and said, "In the past, Group 7 took on undercover work for the government and cooperated with the Bureau of Proclamation many times. I know that the Bureau of Proclamation is not to be trifled with. Not to be trifled with. The Constitution is dead, but people are alive. But the officials in the Bureau of Proclamation are really like dead people. Although I heard that in that building, they would also tell some unfunny jokes like these brats in Group 7. Bai Yulan raised her head, looked into Suli's eyes and said, "But last night, news came from the battleship. The official surnamed Nyo, who was knocked out by you, was taken back to the main planet for treatment. However, the Bureau of Proclamation did not come up with any specific disciplinary measures against you. There's also something very puzzling. I heard that the Bureau of Proclamation team was severely criticized by the Bureau." Suli's expression was calm. Even if all the friends around him and far away were worried about his safety, he was not too worried. He said, "In fact, I've been thinking for the past few days. The Bureau of Proclamation actually values Group 7 very much. Other than us, look at the other groups in the company, including Black Hawk and Green Dragon Mountain. Which one of them would have a technical official from the Bureau of Proclamation?" Bai Yulan said the news she just found out because she wanted to see Suli's reaction and see if this matter had anything to do with him. At this time, Suli's answer did not solve her question at all. In the federal fleet that was patrolling outside the planet's atmosphere, the body of the command ship was not the largest, nor was it the most conspicuous. In the command hall on the second-last floor, the Supreme Commander of the Theater of Operations, Deputy Commander E, sat silently in a large restraint chair. The cup of coffee next to his hand was already cold, but the general's mind could not be completely calm. As a senior commander who had experienced hundreds of battles, the fierce battle on the planet below could not affect his mood too much. Instead, the reaction of the Bureau of Proclamation yesterday had deeply shocked him. Confining Sulu in the barracks of Group 7 was a military order that he personally signed. This was to protect the future of the young military. It was natural for the military to protect its own people. However, in his opinion, it would be difficult for Fei City and Zhouingxing to directly exert influence on the Bureau of Proclamation. The only person who could save Sulu from the first charter was probably Mrs. Macho. After all, the Tai family had a close relationship with Sulu, and the director of the Bureau of Proclamation just happened to have the surname of Macho. Zhouingxing had not done anything in the past few days, but Sulu was still safe and sound. He was so comfortable in confinement. Chapter 473. Macho didn't do anything at the back of the mountain, but there was no strong wind coming from the Bureau of Proclamation building. This fact surprised many people, and even made Deputy Commander E feel waves of coldness coming from the back of his head. Although he, like many senior military officers, watched Suli's every step on the front line as if they were looking at a newborn beast, and he also knew the expectations that old Commander Fei Chong had for this young man, the scene that happened in front of him was really hard for him to understand, or even to imagine. The Bureau of Proclamation official who was knocked unconscious by Sulu was taken back to the main planet of the West Woods. What shocked everyone was that the Bureau of Proclamation not only did not immediately come up with a proposal to punish Sulu, but also severely criticized the three groups of officials at the front line. The fierceness of the criticism was beyond people's imagination. What did this mean? The Bureau of Proclamation did not intend to hold Sulu accountable, but instead showed a cold face to its subordinates because of the anger of this young lieutenant colonel? No one dared to believe this inference, including Deputy Commander E. Through the floor-to-ceiling porthole, he looked at the line-shaped radar on the gray-white battleship shell, and the planet that was blue and gray-yellow. He fell into silenced S1 Capital Special District, at the end of the dead-end road, inside the gray Bureau of Proclamation building under the shade of green trees. An in-depth conversation about this matter was taking place. They only know how to stick to the dead rules all day long, and they still have to play the role of judge and guide in front of the troops. If I were not an officer at the front line, I'm afraid I would have already picked up the Kian and swept all these guys to death. The old director stared at the holographic screen that rose above the table, and a trace of deep mockery appeared on his slightly drooping lips. He continued in a light voice, "They can always act as harmonious and peaceful as a family comedy actor in this building, as if everyone is a changed or uglier Jian Shuier, telling witty jokes, and filling the office and underground with warm laughter forever. I always thought that a group of officials like this would not immediately turn into robots once they were released." After a moment of silence, Cui Zhedong uneasily smiled and replied, "The officials who left the Bureau of Proclamation will always have some sense of superiority in their bones. Besides, after all, the business we are engaged in involves the safety of the Federation, so in addition to having a high level of authority, the staff must also have the sincere cooperation of the other troops of the Federation." Director Yi waved his hand to stop Cui Zhedong's explanation and said, "If you have the authority and want to cooperate sincerely, then don't always think of using your authority to oppress others. As for the sense of superiority, they are just a group of service staff. I really don't know where this bullshit sense of superiority comes from." The smile on the old director's lips became more and more unfathomable. He said, "The safety of the Federation will always be related to the old guy, and it has nothing to do with us extension programs and cleaners." Cui Zhedong was silent and smiled bitterly. He knew that the director was telling the truth, but the ordinary people and the various departments of the Federation did not know the internal workings of the Bureau of Proclamation. Glory shrouded everywhere, and the sense of mystery grew deeper because of the strict charter discipline, which was why the staff of the Bureau of Proclamation were so respected and revered. If there were no major accidents, such as the sudden opposition of two-thirds of the members of the Federation in the Parliament, Assistant Cui Zhedong would be the next director of the Bureau of Proclamation. However, in front of the old director, who had raised him single-handedly, he could not express any more persuasion or opposition. Last night, the director had personally signed a written document and scolded all the officers of the Bureau of Proclamation on the front lines. He did not know if this would improve the cooperation between the officers and the front lines. "What I am most worried about now is Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's authority level." He looked at the director's slightly tired face and uneasily brought up another topic. "Right now we can't find out his exact authority level through various methods. However, according to Baiji's report and the testimony of another officer, he does indeed have the first sequence authority. In that case, the final activation program of the 163 network was indeed issued by him." 3 questions. Director Yi's expression became serious. First, when did he have this authority level? Second, why did he have this authority level? Third, in that base in the wilderness there was no activation program in his hands. What method did he use to order the central computer to activate the entire network? Director Yi slowly closed his eyes and said in a low voice, "We all know that Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu is the 72nd anomaly. We have been paying attention to him, but who can explain these 3 questions? Especially the last question. The data monitoring channel on the warship did not capture his communication with the central computer at all. Who can explain this problem?" "There is no explanation," Cui Zhedong answered seriously. Director Yi was silent for a long time. Then he opened his eyes. With a slightly cloudy gaze, he looked at the continuously flashing white mechanical characters on the light screen in front of him, and then fell like a waterfall. His voice was extremely calm. "Old man, can you answer these 3 questions?" The continuously pouring white mechanical characters on the light screen suddenly stopped and condensed into a line of clear human words. Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's acquisition of the first sequence authority is completely in accordance with the first charter. Other than this sentence, the cold and mechanical Federal Central Computer did not give any additional explanation. This was the umpteenth time the two leaders of the Bureau of Proclamation in the room had tried this kind of inquiry. They were extremely familiar with the Central Computer's answer. They knew that this meant that the granting of the authority level was a top secret. A top secret that even I do not have the authority to know. What kind of top secret is it? The beautiful scene before the catastrophe, or the promiscuous private life of the five-man team? Director Yi's slightly drooping lips were once again filled with mockery, but this time it was self-mockery. From a certain perspective, this office of the Bureau of Proclamation was even more important than the president's official residence. The dead silence at this moment clearly showed how Su Li's level of authority level troubled the two people in the room. After a long silence, a faint light suddenly flashed through Director Yi's cloudy eyes. He said, "When was the authority level given out?" This time the Federal Central Computer did not hesitate and gave a very specific date, down to the second. At that time Su Lu had already escaped from Donglin and was in the capital ring. He was the leader of Team 7 before the assassination. Cui Zedong had been secretly observing Su Lu for more than a year. As one of the very few people who knew Su Li's true identity, he warily and uneasily weaved the events that had happened to Su Lu into a deep time chain in his mind. That was why he blurted it out at this moment. Directory was silent for a long time. Then, he took a deep breath and said with a sigh condensed from decades of work, "Humans will never be able to understand the thought pattern of this computer underground. Old man, don't you think so?" The characters on the light screen condensed again. "I don't know. Since you don't know, then what are you doing? I don't care anymore." Directory stood up shakily and took out the golf club that he had used for many years from the back of his office chair. He smiled at Cui Zedong and said a few words before walking out of the door. Cui Zedong watched his back and could not help but bitterly laugh. The director had played golf for 30 years, but he still stubbornly refused to distinguish between iron and wooden clubs. Perhaps only such a powerful person with obsessive-compulsive disorder was qualified to be in charge of the Bureau of Proclamation. However, even the old director had left with a sigh in front of the lieutenant colonel named Su Lu twice in a row and did not ask again. He looked at the white mechanical characters that poured out like a waterfall on the light screen again, and the corner of his eyes twitched slightly. In the end, it turned into a sigh. Was the first charter of the Federation 700,000 or 1,700,000 words? How much storage space would it take to put all those documents with additional annotations that were like a vast ocean? During his life as a fugitive, Su Lu was extremely afraid of the first charter that covered countless aspects of life in the Federation but was invisible to him like air. Therefore, he did not dare to say that he completely understood the first charter even after studying it for a long time in the gatehouse and library of Yue University. From this perspective, should the military police be the soldiers that protect the dignity of the first charter? Su Lu sat inside the door while Bai Yulan leaned against the door. 2 cigarettes were enough to send the other party away, but they did not have much confidence in their hearts. Even the former who had the ultimate weapon of mass destruction was the same. Other than the news from last night, the most important news right now is that this morning, the general attack on Planet 3320 has officially begun. Bai Yulan took a drag of the cigarette and said softly. Su Li's eyes lit up. Planet 3320 was the most important military operation for this victory. The main forces of the Imperial Expeditionary Force were stationed here. The federal military had also invested the most powerful forces on this planet. The enemy's headquarters was placed on the battleship above the planet. The Tiger of the West Woods, who led the frontline forces, had also been eyeing this planet covetously. This is a truly important matter. How can our small matter compare to it? He shook his head and said, but no one answered. Because of the pressure of the invisible existence and the unknown feeling of not knowing what the outcome would be, the conversation inside and outside the confinement room was particularly dry. The expressions of several people were somewhat dull. Not far away, under the shade of a tree, the members of Group 7 also appeared somewhat powerless because of the dry air and stifling temperature of the plateau. They lowered their heads and silently carried out gun maintenance. They no longer had the energy to chat or sing unpleasant folk songs. If the headquarters really gave a cold and cruel punishment to Sulu, they would certainly be hot-headed, flipping out, and mutiny. No matter how bleak the final outcome, they would still seek revenge. However, the cold treatment of this matter by the higher-ups made them unable to use their strength. They were extremely depressed. Just as this seemingly endless dreary life that seemed to go on day after day and seemed to go on for countless days made their bodies dry and weak, a military vehicle suddenly drove to the front door of the barracks, and an officer walked out. The members of Group 7 all stood up and looked at him with vigilant eyes. However, no one would have thought that this officer would silently walk to the front of the confinement room, wave his hand, and call 2 military police away. Without saying a word to the members in the barracks, he got on the military vehicle and left. The members were stunned. Chapter 474. The light always shone in from outside the door, and Su Li's shadow always fell backward, unable to cross the threshold in front of him, just like how he still had a somewhat rule-abiding personality in his bones. He stood at the door and kept scratching his head in hesitation, unable to take a step forward for a long time, even though he knew that taking a step forward would mean some kind of freedom. No one issued an order, and the command center did not issue any instructions, but the 2 military police officers had already left silently. Was this a step to take or not to take? The members of Group 7 did not care about this. They all swarmed over and flooded into the confinement room that was originally off-limits. They raised their guns with one hand and cheered heartily, forcibly squeezing Sulu out of the room with human waves and foot odor. His feet landed on the fresh soil, and he was already sitting under the shade of a big tree. His 5 hands were spread out like branches, and his 5 hands were filled with cigarettes handed to him by his team members. Sulu could not help but sigh like an old man. So this is freedom. The Federal Army under the command of the Tiger of the Westwoods forcibly resisted the questioning of the parliament members of the Capitol Ring. After dozens of days of silence, they quietly reconstructed the charter network, and then began an all-out offensive on the 3 fallen planets. More than 90 divisions were like countless hungry tigers, roaring on the surface of the 3 planets. With the computing power of the Federal Central Computer and the demon-revealing effect of the glory of the charter, they ruthlessly beat down the last main force of the Imperial Expeditionary Force. The current situation was very good for the Federation. The victorious military operation had entered the critical phase, and the countless combat teams responsible for laying the network on the 3 planets ushered in a rare rest time. They boarded the transport ships of the Federation and returned to the main planet of the West Woods. During the days of waiting for the rotational break, the silence of the Bureau of Proclamation made all the soldiers and soldiers of the base certain that Sulu would accept any punishment. What a scene of spring sunshine and high spirits! Taking advantage of the fact that none of the superiors dared to challenge Sulu at this time, the old members of Group 7 took the risk of going deep into the war zone. They collected the bodies of the sacrificed members at the riverbank and burned them into countless palms of gray-white and uneven bone ash. They stored them in a ceremonial military coffin with great care. When they suddenly received the order to retreat, the members of Group 7 were filled with unwillingness, especially the new members. They looked at the cannons in the distance and felt excited. They wanted to rush to the front lines and kill the enemy. They wanted to avenge their fallen comrades. However, half of the 100 or so members were injured. Half of the injured were heavily injured, and half of the seriously injured had already been sacrificed. With such a huge loss, it was impossible for the military command to allow them to remain at the front line. At this moment, Lan Xiaolong said indifferently, "There will be more battles in the future. Just wait and see." This sentence convinced many people. Although it was difficult to say that the members retreated willingly, they did not have too many conflicting emotions. On the transport ship returning to the main planet, the members of Group 7 received another gift. The Shell Motor Company sent a generous allowance to all the members' accounts. This was an order signed by the CEO of the Shell Motor Company. It bypassed the Whitewater Security Company and was directly transferred to the members' personal accounts. It was to commend them for their achievements on the front lines in the Westwoods, for their contributions to the Federation's peace and for their contributions to the Shell Motor Company. A monthly allowance of 170,000 Federation dollars was undoubtedly a rare benefit in the Federation. However, the new members of Group 7, those hedonistic old soldiers, really did not care about this. They had a good environment and a prominent family background. It was enough for them to see this as a small amount of money. But what was very strange was that after the new members received this allowance, they were all very excited. This was because, for them, this kind of money that they earned themselves was a rare honor and the most authentic sense of accomplishment. Beside the porthole of the warship, Symbol once said seriously, "Motherfucker, this is the first money that I earned. In the end it was exchanged with my life. I have to spend it all to feel good." The Federation's air-to-ground transport ship had a unique shape. It was like an all-terrain fighter that had been enlarged many times. However, its two wings were particularly wide and thick. Its entire body was silver white, and it was like a fat goose. Therefore, every time the transport ship entered the atmosphere and slowly landed, it would always attract a lot of curiosity and fresh gazes from the public. It was really rare to see a fully metal goose swaying and breaking through the air, creating countless sharp whistling sounds as it descended. However, this was not the case these 2 days because there were too many Federation's transport ships that had landed above the base. After the general attack on the 3 fallen planets was launched, the more than 20,000 net-laying teams all retreated back to the main planet in a short period of 3 days. The transport ship took off and landed so frequently that even the workers outside the base who were responsible for unblocking the canals were a little bored. In the northwest corner of Long Wind Base, the members of Group 7 walked out from the belly door of the transport ship in a single file. Then they stood solemnly on the tarmac in the strong wind and waited in formation. Behind them, 6 recruits wearing white gloves slowly walked over. They were carrying a black ceremonial military coffin. Their faces were red, but their expressions were extremely serious. The corners of their military uniforms did not tremble in the slightest. All around them, there were soldiers who had finished their mission cheering as they walked past. It was not easy for them to leave the bloody front line and welcome a rare opportunity to rest and play. Once they were disbanded, the heroic Federation soldiers turned into countless wild ducks without hesitation and flew away in all directions. Group 7 in formation was not disturbed in the slightest. They still stood solemnly in formation and did not wrinkle their brows even when the wind blew. The other troops who were cheering also noticed the abnormality. After a few whispers, they knew that they were Group 7. They subconsciously lowered their pink voices and even their footsteps became much softer. The last ones to walk down the warship were Su Lu, Bai Yulan, and Lan Xiaolong. The 3 of them represented the highest leadership level of Group 7. This was not a rule set by the military or the Nutshell Company, but a natural result of their bloody fighting career. Su Lu walked to the front of the team. Bai Yulan and Lan Xiaolong very tacitly stopped and stood behind him. He was wearing the sunglasses that Zhou Yu sent over half a year ago. He was holding a thick tobacco that was specially sent by 7th Young Master Li. He silently stood there and seemed to be extremely cool. But this seemed to be a little too similar to Du Shaoqing. Su Lu looked at the solemn team and laughed at himself in his heart. He took off the sunglasses, revealing a pair of sincere and amiable small eyes. He took off the thick tobacco in his mouth and threw it to Yan Bingyan, who was the most addicted to smoking in the team. "Attention!" Lan Xiaolong loudly shouted behind him. The members of Group 7 all stood at attention and did not move. Su Lu glanced at the ceremonial military coffin on the right side of the team that contained the ashes of his subordinates. After a moment of silence, he said, "I once had a conversation with a respectable lady. I believe that people will always die, and only reasons can make them stay. But if you think about it seriously, the truth that everyone firmly believes in, which means that the truth that we judge for ourselves, may not necessarily last forever." He narrowed his eyes and continued, "But I still believe that some things are more important than death. For example, resisting the invasion of the Imperium, saving the survivors of the 3 fallen planets, making the Imperium pay for their slaughter. No matter whether these reasons can last forever, I believe that the vitality of these reasons is much longer than the lives of us in our 80s or 90s. So some sacrifices are valuable. Sulu looked at the military coffin on the right side of the team and the Federation flag on the coffin and said, "Not to mention that these brothers died so that you could live, so I believe that even if it is for them, you should live a better life." He saw that the son of the governor, Da Vinci, had a warm smile on his lips and nodded vigorously. "Please forget them and live a good life," Sulu finally said. Lan Xiaolong loudly shouted behind him, "Dismissed." "Well said," Bai Yulan said behind him. "I am not born with a stone. I told you last time, but I got used to using my fists, which made me seem a little barbaric and monotonous." Sulu looked at the slightly restless team members and said with a trace of self-mockery, "When I was young, I didn't know how sharp my tongue was. And don't forget, I have the qualifications to be a level 1 technical supervisor of the Nutshell Mobile. No matter what, I should be considered an intellectual, right?" Bai Yulan was silent and thought to herself, "You are starting to mention the youth that no one knows about again." She couldn't help but feel a little depressed, her willowy eyebrows fluttering in the wind on the tarmac. The members of Team 7 didn't take the military vehicles sent by the base and walked to the periphery. The team members followed the style of Old 7 and Unit 8384. Their expressions were slick, and every bone seemed incomparably loose. They walked with the demeanor of a hooligan. However, unlike the other troops, they didn't disperse in a hubbub. Originally, they were in a square formation, but at this time they became a loose mass of meat, tightly united around Sulu in the center, not willing to disperse even a single step. Sulu looked at the heads around him and felt a little strange. He thought that the disbanding was already announced, but the members of Team 7, this rich army, didn't really disperse. Right at this time, Shipeng squeezed to his side and hesitantly asked in a low voice, "Boss, just now you said that we have to forget our dead brothers and live well. We feel that it is very reasonable. They want to ask you, do you want to go with us?" "Go to do what?" Sulu asked. "To do what you said." Shipeng began to fumble for the cigarettes in her military uniform and said with a silly smile, "We are going to find some women." The wind and long wind bass seemed to suddenly become stronger, blowing the expression on Suli's face to become extremely complicated and interesting. 3 hours later, there was a street 13 kilometers away from the Golden Star Hotel. The street was full of three-dimensional fantasy lights. Countless beautiful waitresses wearing light purple dresses were politely and quietly waiting outside the shop next to the Stone Lions. The Sunset nightclub in Sunset State was the largest and most luxurious entertainment venue. Tonight, it was booked by a group of rough men wearing military uniforms without epaulets. Turning around and looking at the nightclub that he had managed for several years, a bitter smile appeared on the manager's face. He wondered what the origin of the army inside was. The Golden Resplendence, which was enough to accommodate 500 guests at the same time, was actually booked by a few dozen people without any hesitation. In terms of background, Group 7 was without a doubt the most untouchable team. This team was filled with the descendants of the chairman, the sons of the governor, and the sons of tycoons. To go against the forces behind these princes at the same time, other than the strong and stubborn President Pabre, probably only someone with a temperament like Sulu could do it. This group of old soldiers who didn't care about the amount of money naturally didn't understand the meaning of sharing and saving. To spend an allowance of 170,000 yuan per person in one night, other than the Golden Resplendence, there was really no other place to go. It's nothing. Normal people wouldn't dare to provoke this nightclub. Bai Yulan walked back from the entrance and said to the slightly worried Sulu, "The owner of this nightclub has some connections. I heard that he can freely enter and leave Latitude 2 District 36. Sulu felt that this name was familiar and asked, "Where is this place?" "The old house of the Zhong family in the Westwoods," Bai Yulan replied. Sulu nodded. Someone who could freely enter and leave the old house of the Zhong family probably didn't dare to provoke in the Westwoods. But why did the address of the old house of the Zhong family sound so familiar to him? While he was seriously recalling, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of music coming from downstairs. The outer walls of the Golden Resplendence nightclub were covered with faint blue lights, but the lights inside the building were mainly lavender, reflecting on the black and gray decorative walls and floor, making it look quite stylish. On the wine island carved from fragrant wood, there were all kinds of mixed drinks, and the lavender lights rippled in the wine, creating a charming hue. To the west was an exaggerated glass wall, and the wall was filled with natural seawater. Countless small golden fish were following two long golden arowanas as they swam up and down. Inside the transparent hall on the second floor, waitresses in extremely short uniforms were carrying black wooden trays, smiling as they wandered around. Their slender white high heels supported their slender white legs, and the exquisite design of their uniforms outlined the curves of the young girls. When the soothing music became slightly more passionate, the waitresses' long legs seemed to become lighter, and with their soft waists and bright red full lips on their delicate faces, it was enough to arouse the desire in the depths of any man's heart. The members of Group 7 talked and laughed loudly as they drank the good wine in their glasses. Not long after, all the mixed drinks were taken away and replaced with Wenjun No. 3. Wenjun brandy, one of the most famous spirits in the Federation, was produced in the Ganzhou Hills district of Region S3. Among them, No. 3 was a treasure that had been in the cellar for more than 30 years. Not only was it expensive, but it was also rare. These rich kids ordered 80 bottles of No. 3 as soon as they opened their mouths. Even the golden resplendence was caught off guard, and it took them a full 20 minutes to get it. Alcohol, music, cigarettes, and beautiful women. A psychedelic atmosphere shrouded the air inside the building, washing away the light purple lights and making them even dimmer. Some of the members of Group 7 were playing billiards, some were throwing darts, and some were already drunk. They were doing something they would never do in the capital ring, and that was holding a microphone and singing the military's bloody battle song with a hoarse voice as if their lives depended on it. A few of the members who drank an entire bottle of spirits in 5 minutes were already drunk, and their eyes were in a mess. For some reason, sorrow rose from their hearts, and they hugged the people beside them and cried bitterly. Then they got up and drank again and laughed exaggeratedly. The so-called battlefield PTSD, or the thought of sacrificed comrades, always made people more emotional like little animals. The manager and service staff of the nightclub had long been used to this kind of scene, but they were a little moved by the extravagance of these soldiers, and secretly hoped that these people would not cause trouble after drinking. Since they had booked the whole place, all the girls in the nightclub came out. A few hundred girls accompanied the 80 to 90 men, and each member had 2 or 3 girls next to them. Although the forest of flesh beside the wine pool was covered by trimmed willow leaves, it could not hide the waves of perfume and fragrance that filled the entire place. The scene was spectacular. The girls' eyes were like flowers. Although they were young, they had already seen countless people, and they had long seen the difference in this group of soldiers. Although they looked like ordinary soldiers, the stack of cash that appeared in their soft breasts from time to time made them wonder if they had the right to say that they were knowledgeable. Were there really so many rich young masters and soldiers in this world? Su Lu and a few officers sat in the largest private room on the second floor. In front of them, there were members who rushed upstairs to propose a toast. Even he was forced to drink a few glasses and he was a little tipsy. In the end, he could not resist the eager and passionate gazes of the people around him, and he agreed to let the girls in. The most important thing in the Federal Army was honor, a sense of belonging and a strict hierarchy. Everything had to be followed by rules. Even the absurd collective whoring of prostitutes had to be followed by rules. Therefore, the most famous girls of the majestic nightclub had always been reserved for this big box. None of the members downstairs dared to talk to them. The red card girls who had been standing outside the door for a long time were very curious about the guests who had booked the whole place today. And even more so, they wanted to know who was sitting in the main private room. At this time, when the order was given, the girls entered in a line with guessing intentions. They lined up in 2 rows in front of the main room. Some bowed their heads shyly, some were calm and gentle, and some had vicissitudes of life in their eyes. There were many different styles. At this time, Sulu put down his wine glass and subconsciously looked up. Suddenly, he saw a girl wearing a black dress looking at him with her mouth slightly open. A trace of surprise flashed through his heart. He felt that this girl was somewhat familiar, as if he had seen her somewhere before. At this time, the members in the private room, who had long been unable to hold themselves back, began to take attendance. Shi Peng, who had the highest status among the young masters, had long been accustomed to his existence as Su Li's personal guard. He held a thick stick of tobacco and very familiarly arranged people. Of course, he first arranged the best girl to be next to Su Lu. No one would have thought that at this time. The girl wearing the black dress gently clenched her fists and nervously walked over to Su Lu. This was definitely against the rules. Xi Peng's eyebrows wrinkled. The female manager who led the team into the room had a slightly panicked expression. She didn't know if she would offend these people of unknown origin, but obviously not to be trifled with. At this time, Su Lu suddenly scratched his head and happily grinned. He didn't dare to be sure and asked, "Lulu?" The girl wearing the black dress was slightly startled. It seemed that she didn't expect this little boy to remember her name. A trace of pleasant surprise appeared on her face, and she sweetly smiled and sat down. The room was silent. Whether it was the members or the girls, they all looked at the young man and woman in astonishment. The girls were shocked that Lulu actually knew this big shot who was obviously a senior officer. The members of Group 7 were more shocked and envious. They secretly thought to themselves, no wonder the frontline troops always said that their manager was a dog that bites but doesn't bark. What a well-behaved young man. Who would have thought that he was actually such a playboy? As the prospective son-in-law of the Minister of Defense, he had an ambiguous relationship with the national idol who was doted on by tens of thousands of people. He even had who knows how many times with that green dragon Mountain Yi. Now that he was countless light years away from the capital ring, he could actually casually walk into a nightclub and see his old flame. "I'm going home. I need to quickly pass the road test in the next 2 days and then go back to Daqing to fix up the house." The feeling during the annual meeting was actually very good. It was rare for everyone to get together, drink some wine and talk. To be honest, what we talked about was mostly about writing books. We were more dedicated to our work than we thought. As for the card game that Whitebird mentioned, that was organized by that guy. 72 the Enchantress, and I were all dragged to the table by him. 72 the Enchantress, and I didn't know how to play at all. I swear on my father's integrity that this fatty did this last year. We only played for an hour in total. 72 and I didn't lose a single cent and didn't win a single cent. The winner won very little and even had to treat us to hot pot. Snowball had more than 10 people and played 2 tables. The Enchantress paid the bill and won the Enchantress. They only won 40 renminbi. Isn't this a huge loss? Yes. Speaking of the book, I really wrote that chapter when I was drunk. Today, I seriously looked back and found that other than a few typos, the quality was really good. It was very unexpected. During the dinner at night, I was still chatting with my friends. After drinking, I could only write poems, but it was difficult to write stories. Except for a god like Blood Red. But it seems that is not the case. Although drinking makes one sleepy, as long as one's obsession is strong enough and one keeps the promise, one can always write something good. Yesterday, when they saw the words resplendent on the road to Kunming, all the comrades from Shanghai collectively exclaimed, "Of course you have to believe that I'm from CJ. All of us are from CJ. This is the truth. This society is not as CJ as we want it to be." If you seriously think about it, this group of otakus who write web novels are the most CJ people. Chapter 476. The door was tightly shut, and the music in the luxurious private room started again, but no one was singing. In the mixed atmosphere of tobacco and alcohol, the members of Group 7 and the red card girls beside them whispered to each other. They seemed to be chatting happily, but in fact their eyes and hearts were always looking in that direction. The high-grade, densely woven fabric covering the sofa was like lines on a zebra. At the end of the line in the darkness, or in other words at the end of the line, Su Lu was holding a wine glass with both hands and chatting with the girl in the black dress with great interest. The people in the room were very curious. Who was this girl named Lulu? What was the relationship between her and Su Lu? How have you been recently? Su Lu looked into her eyes seriously and asked. Because of his attitude, Lulu felt very warm. She pursed her lips and said with a sweet smile, "Of course it's better to do it in the nightclub than in the Stars Club. It's just that the Westwoods is too far away from home, and it's hard to go home. Sometimes, I feel too bored. I didn't expect to see someone I know today." It was a small story from a long time ago. If it wasn't for the scandal of the national girl that all the media outlets in the Federation were hyping up last year, and the image of Sulu wearing sunglasses appeared on TV many times, Lulu might not have remembered the cute and interesting boy from back then. It was also because of the TV news that she learned that the cute boy she met once was now a celebrity in the Federation. She was shocked and naturally paid more attention to his news. That was why she was able to recognize Sulu at a glance under the psychedelic light tonight. At that time she was very nervous, but still bravely stood up and recommended herself under the light. She didn't expect him to remember her, but for some reason she had a faint desire. Unexpectedly, he actually recognized her. Yes, this beautiful girl in the black dress was Lulu, the girl that Sulu met in the lounge of the club when he took Taizion for a date. That story was too old and subtle. Other than leaving a legend of a chicken turning into a phoenix in Linhai's nightclub, it couldn't leave too many marks in the numb history of the nightclub. Ace Baichi became the mistress of a mysterious young man, and her sisters from back then still had to continue their lives of selling sex. Sulu shouldn't have remembered, but he really didn't. Human memory was always a wonderful thing. Perhaps they would never meet again, but there would always be a few beautiful fragments left in the bottom of their hearts. That day when he woke up in the clubhouse, his fingertips touched the girl's soft thighs. This beautiful girl, who was younger than him but forced him to call her sister Lulu, wore pajamas and a pair of slippers, and insisted on painting her toenails next to him. With a hint of teasing, she kept seducing him. He also chatted with her in the clubhouse, playing cards and chatting with her in the clubhouse's room, bored and full of absurdity. These were all memories that were hard to forget. Sulu poured her a glass of wine. Looking at the girl who didn't age but was even more beautiful, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart that didn't match his age. At that time he was a poor concierge and she was a girl in the clubhouse. Now, he was a famous person in the Federation, leading hundreds of people and holding many guns. She was still the same kind of girl, but she just changed her workplace. Time passed too quickly. A few years had passed in the blink of an eye, and the world had changed a lot. Taizion, the lifeless prince, would probably never be the real crazy teenager like he was back then. Lulu took a sip of wine and noticed the surprised expressions of the other people in the room. She couldn't help but feel nervous. She slightly looked up at Sulu. From an ordinary girl in the clubhouse in Linhai City to a popular girl in the Golden Splendor nightclub, she must have been doing well these years. In fact, she was very beautiful back then, but she was too stubborn when she was young, so she couldn't stand out. Over the years, she gradually cut off the stubbornness of her youth, and her whole person seemed to be quieter and gentler, but it was unknown whether it was the appearance that had been tempered by the vicissitudes of life. This place is very formal, and the owner treats us well. We directly go to the second-level medical insurance, and we are responsible for a round trip every year. Lulu smiled and continued the previous topic. Probably because she felt like they had just met, she suppressed her nervousness and took the initiative to sit next to Sulu. However, she didn't want him to show a trace of sympathy for her, so she answered very seriously and pretended to be calm. Sulu himself was a mining orphan at the bottom of society. When he was young, he went to various sanatoriums with his uncle, and was used to being teased by those sisters. How could he show sympathy for her? That's not bad. He answered very seriously, and then without hesitation, he told her his contact information. Lulu was obviously stunned by his actions. Didn't this young man know that they were on two different levels? Shouldn't he keep a distance from her to avoid trouble? Suli's tone was very serious, and his action of leaving his contact information was very natural. The girl was extremely warmed by his action of revealing his true nature. She raised her head and looked at him in a daze. After a long while, she came back to her senses. She lowered her head and poured a glass of wine to hide her true emotions. She asked sincerely in a low voice, "Can you tell me how Baichi is now?" Back then, Baichi was only an A-list prostitute in the clubhouse. She couldn't even be considered a high-class prostitute. After a night of sex, she became an official mistress of the Qianshi Tai family. Although only a few people knew the true identity of her patron, she was already a legend in the Linhai entertainment scene. However, Lulu had always been worried about this sister of hers who had never been heard from again. Sulu heard the sincerity in her question, and thought that this girl's temperament was really good. After pondering for a moment, he said with a smile, "As far as I know, she's doing very well." Because of his emotions, Sulu drank a few glasses of strong wine in a row. He was very drunk, but his stomach felt a little hungry. He really wanted to eat something. His right hand unnaturally wrapped around Lulu's soft waist. His fingertips touched the slightly warm smoothness through the thin fabric of her clothes. It was a little stiff. Lulu clearly felt the change in Suli's mood and snickered in her heart. Then she really felt a trace of shyness that she hadn't felt in a long time. She curiously raised her beautiful face and looked at his side profile seriously. She was looking forward to what would happen tonight. To be honest, she was really willing. It wasn't because the student back then had become a big shot, but because of the details tonight, the beautiful details. Sulu noticed that the atmosphere in the private room was a little strange. The music was getting louder and louder, and the lights were getting blurry. However, the men and women in the room were sitting on the sofa with slightly uneasy expressions. A trace of embarrassment flashed across Lulu's face. She gently bit her plump red lips and whispered in his ear, "The topless costume should have been over a long time ago." Oh. When Sulu was in the capital, he was often dragged to some high-class clubs by the seventh young Master Li. He saw a lot of the charming and even obscene scenes of those small stars off stage. Although he had never really tasted meat, he was not unfamiliar with this situation. After a moment of silence, he knew that it was because he was in the private room that the team members were a little uneasy. He was even more unwilling to let Lulu stay here. Although she was definitely not anyone to him, but when he thought of that kind of scene, his hidden male heart began to feel unhappy. He took Lulu's hand and stood up. He said to the people in the room, "We're going to eat supper. You guys have fun." The 7 men were stunned for a moment. They stared blankly at Sulu dragging the beautiful girl out of the room. When they saw the door was closed, they finally understood what had happened. In an instant, a burst of strong cheers broke out. Bai Yulan, who had been silently sitting in the shadows, pulled away the girl's hand that was on her thigh. She gave a few of the older team members a look. The team members in the hall of the nightclub watched Sulu drag the girl out of the building. Under the influence of alcohol, they completely forgot the hatred and fear they had for this guy. One after another, they whistled excitedly. The whistling made Lulu shy like never before. Her cheeks suddenly turned red. It wasn't until they walked out of the nightclub and stood under the blue sky that the cool sea breeze in the distance woke her up a little. She knew that all this wasn't a dream. "Although I know that at this time it's best not to disturb you, but for your safety we have to follow." Bai Yulan, Xiong Linquan, and a few others hurried out of the nightclub. She looked at Sulu and said with a bitter smile, "No need." Sulu smiled and shook his head. "We're just going to eat supper." Everyone raised a middle finger in their hearts at the same time. Bai Yulan said calmly, "Don't forget the news that the Ministry of Defense and the Federation Bureau of Investigation sent last time. The 2 experts from Bermuda want to kill you. The Sunset State is their only chance." Lulu, who had been leaning against Sulu like a docile little lamb, raised her head in surprise. She did not understand what they were talking about. "Don't worry. The 2 experts haven't come to the Sunset State yet. When they arrive, I'll tell you. I believe that you, the real experts, won't just stand by and watch me be killed by them," Sulu said with certainty. It was difficult for him to explain the source of his information to his subordinates. Under the cover of certain aristocratic families, the Federation Bureau of Investigation was unable to track down the 2 killers. However, he was the #1 target of protection under the charter. The moment the Federal Central Computer received the alert, it began to comb through all the new chip signals that entered the border between the West Woods and Bermuda. Faced with such a huge amount of data flow, only the Central Computer, whose computing power was unimaginably terrifying, could make an accurate judgment by consuming a large amount of resources. In fact, in less than 2 days after the 2 experts from Bermuda entered the West Woods, all their tracks had been tracked down by the old man and then sent to Sulu. The glory of the charter was like a holy light behind Sulu. Within the Federation, who could assassinate him? Bai Yulan was silent for a moment. She glanced at the girl beside him and said softly, "Be careful of your influence." 5 minutes later, Sulu and Lulu arrived at a night market not far from the nightclub. hand in hand. Because the sea breeze was a little dry? Because they had seen too many deaths on the battlefield? Or perhaps it was because they had met a girl from the past on the front lines far away from home. No one in the Sunset State would recognize him at night. He held the girl's hand without restraint. It was soft and very comfortable. In front of them was a large chrysanthemum garden by the sea. Therefore, this night market was called the Chrysanthemum Night Market. Sitting on a high stool beside the circular food tray, Sulu didn't have time to gently stroke the girl's hair that was messed up by the sea breeze. His slightly narrowed eyes fell on the two sides. There were two groups of soldiers sitting on both sides of the night market. One group of soldiers was wearing light military uniforms without any insignia. They sat upright and had strict military discipline. They were the anti-government troops from Green Dragon Mountain, who had come to the front lines of the Westwoods to provide support. The other group of soldiers who were staring at the anti-government troops from Green Dragon Mountain with hostile eyes were from the 2nd Military Region. Chapter 477. There were chrysanthemums in the Chrysanthemum Night Market, and they were arranged next to the turntable. Sulu was worried about the hidden emotions between the two groups of soldiers. The waiter calmly pushed over a dozen plates of food and 4 bottles of cold beer. Probably because he had seen too many dramas of soldiers in the night market, he was already used to it and wasn't nervous at all. Although the soldiers on both sides of the night market were brewing an angry atmosphere, they probably had misgivings about the military police all over Sunset Province, so they didn't make a move. Sulu shook his head. He used the tip of his finger to scratch his slightly itchy eyebrows. He let go of the worry in his heart and opened the bottle of beer to pour a cup for Lulu. The golden liquid overflowed the cup with foam. Right now, they weren't in the luxurious room of the Golden Splendor nightclub. He and the girl were alone in the sea breeze, and for a moment they couldn't find much to talk about. They were originally strangers, but they coincidentally met many years ago. Suli's silence was because some of the troops were nervous. The smoke of the battlefield and the contract of life and death could arouse the instinctive desires of humans. It was probably because of the fear of death that the subconscious delayed the outbreak of lust. He was a normal young man, so on this cold night, he naturally had some expectations and excitement. Lulu was also secretly a bit nervous, but she also felt awkward because it was completely inconsistent with her profession. Thus, the two could only lower their heads and smile as they drank, chatting about the architectural style of Linhai Province. However, this was not something that Sulu was good at, something that Miss Lulu would know. He didn't know how many glasses of beer had gone down his stomach, but the alcohol had gotten to his head. The girl beside him had become even more beautiful and alluring. Sulu felt his face heat up. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly heard a mocking voice coming from his right. "A bunch of bumpkins. Looks like you're really used to being poor in those crappy mountains. So many of you only order so little to eat. I say, you've already spent so much of our military funds, why are you still pretending to be poor?" The one who said this was an officer of the 2nd Military Region. Probably because he drank too much, he no longer had any scruples and vented all of the disdain and hatred in his heart. When they heard this extremely bitter ridicule, the Federation government soldiers began to roar with laughter. They provocatively shouted at the night market owner, saying that they wanted to add more food to the anti-government army. When the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers heard these noises, they angrily raised their heads and stared in that direction. Dressed in thin, light-colored military uniforms, they looked like a group of miscellaneous soldiers, but their discipline was really very strict. Although they were angry, they maintained absolute silence. However, it was this silence that suddenly erupted with a certain kind of aura, oppressing the entire night market inexplicably. Sulu saw that Lulu was a bit nervous. "Now," he explained, to him. "To the Federation's special force, is now the Federation's first." Hearing his explanation, Lulu didn't feel relieved. The fear on her face became even stronger. After all, she was an ordinary girl living in S1. She had heard a lot of propaganda from the federal government since she was young. It was easy for her to associate the anti-government army with violent, bloody, and cruel words. Sulu remained silent. Today the Federation was reconciled. President Pabre and Nanshue's leader held a historic handshake. The Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army was reorganized into the first special force. However, no one knew when that crack in people's hearts would truly be erased. Even he himself often forgot the name of the first special force. He habitually called these soldiers the anti-government army. The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers in the corner of the night market lowered their heads under the cold gaze of their commanding officer. They continued to quietly eat, from time to time picking up the water bottle beside them to drink a mouthful of water. Sulu looked at the few plates of food on their table, as well as the cheap food on the plates. He felt a bit moved in his heart. He was moved by the other side's iron-like military discipline, as well as their unique temperament. That was a type of idealistic luster that could only be set off by simple and even poverty. But since it had already been reorganized, the Federation government wouldn't go so far as to cut off the other side's supplies. A trace of doubt flashed through Su Li's ink-black brows. He took out a military encrypted phone and dialed Shi Qinghai's number. No one answered the phone. The doubt between his ink-black brows turned into a bit of worry. Mr. Shi was nominated by Green Dragon Mountain and directly appointed by the president to be the liaison officer between the two sides. His position was extremely high. Could it be that he had to go on some dangerous mission? The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers had just returned from the front lines. Their bodies were covered in dust. They had just disembarked from the warship and were randomly looking for a place to fill their stomachs. Unexpectedly, they chose the Chrysanthemum Night Market, the place that soldiers loved to gather. This group of simple and unadorned soldiers used the fastest speed to finish the food on their plates. The plates were very clean and not a single grain of rice was wasted. They then prepared to line up and leave. It was clear that the Green Dragon Mountain troops had received strict instructions before coming to the front lines to avoid conflict with the government army as much as possible. The officer who didn't wear any Federation insignia walked up to the counter and took out a few bills to settle the bill. He said a few words to the waiter and then smiled and nodded his head to express his thanks. The subordinate soldiers knew that they had finished talking. They took out the water bottles beside them and walked up to the counter to begin lining up. In an extremely orderly manner, they collected water from the night market water purifier and filled the water bottles to the brim. Seeing this scene, Sulu was somewhat moved. He wasn't the only one who was moved. After a moment of silence, the soldiers of the 2nd Military Region watched as these Green Dragon Mountain soldiers prepared to leave. Their exceptionally intense emotions stirred up by the alcohol could no longer be controlled. I suddenly understand why these bumpkins who only know how to kill their own people are willing to spend money to come to this night market to eat. A major looked at the Green Dragon Mountain troops who were currently collecting water and said mockingly, "Do you guys understand?" All the officers at the table shook their heads with disdain. Tonight, they had originally planned to invite a few of their comrades from the 3 Military Region to the Golden Splendor nightclub, but in the end, they couldn't enter. They had long been suppressing their anger. On the way, they just so happened to run into a lower-ranked company, so the 100 or so people decided to just drink in the night market. Who would have thought that when they were drunk to the point of excitement, they would run into their mortal enemies? How could they let go of this opportunity to humiliate them? That major coldly laughed and said, "That's because these bastards are so poor that they don't have the money to find women, and they also don't have the qualifications to dance with the female members of the arts and crafts troupe. Now that they've joined us, they don't dare to forcefully snatch female students. This is so fucking sullen. They could only blow up their own people's chrysanthemums." Chrysanthemum night market? I think the barracks they live in are also called chrysanthemum barracks. As soon as these words were spoken, there was another wave of extremely unbridled laughter from the government army. The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers who were currently queuing up to collect water all raised their heads with a whoosh, staring at them angrily. Most of them couldn't keep their cool anymore after being provoked by these malicious words. They began to coldly roll up their thin military uniform sleeves, as if they were rolling up their martial force. In Sunset Province, it was very common for soldiers to fight after drinking. Seeing that the Green Dragon mountainside seemed to be preparing to move, the government army soldiers didn't show any fear. They coldly stood up, gripping the ice-cold beer bottles on the table. That Green Dragon Mountain officer calmly waved his hand, suppressing the anger of his subordinates. After a moment of silence, he looked at the distant government army soldiers and said, "I will make a complaint about today's matter to the headquarters through the liaison office." "You're welcome to make a complaint, Officer Chrysanthemum. However, I advise you to put on the glorious epaulets of the Federal Army before you make a complaint. Since you've already joined us, then don't even think about keeping any face," that major of the 2nd Military Region said. The government soldiers behind him began to whistle, and countless obscenities spewed out. Sulu was silent for a moment. He left his chair and turned to the group of government soldiers on his right. According to his temperament, if these people who deliberately stirred up trouble and disregarded the Federation's overall situation to humiliate Green Dragon Mountain were from other troops, he wouldn't have been able to restrain himself from flipping out long ago. Even though he was an important target of the federal military's nurturing, even though he didn't have the slightest good impression of Green Dragon Mountain's upper echelons, even though he had killed Macklin and punished the son of the Nanshui leader, because of his relationship with Zhang Xiaoming and Shi Qinghai, he emotionally couldn't accept the soldiers of Green Dragon Mountain being humiliated by others. However, the soldiers who humiliated Green Dragon Mountain were from the 2nd Military Region, so he could understand their anger. He quietly listened to this moment. For several decades, the Federation government had been encircling and suppressing Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government forces on S2. Who knew how many people had died from both sides? As the main force, the 2nd Military Region had formed a blood feud with Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government forces. These emotional soldiers of the 2nd Military Region, who were eager to fight, must have had their closest comrades and most respected superiors who had died under the bullets of Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government forces. How could such a grudge be resolved with a simple handshake from politicians? However, this matter was still too much. In the face of the invasion of the Empire, the Federation's general offensive was proceeding vigorously. However, in Sunset Province, a scene of brothers turning against each other was playing out. Sulu couldn't accept it. He shouted at the government soldiers who were clenching their beer bottles tightly, as if they were about to rush out at any moment. "Enough! Do you want the military police to lock all of you up in a small dark room?" However, he had only used force to deal with the old soldiers of the 7th Military Region. He hadn't personally dealt with a disturbance in the army. He didn't know that the soldiers who were completely drunk had naturally entered a state of excitement and preparation for a fight. They were just like the bulls on the electronic wall in Donglin that had been provoked by the uncle. As long as there was even the slightest touch, they would sensitively jump up. The soldiers in this type of state wouldn't care about verbal threats at all. On the contrary, they just happened to need a certain point to arouse the situation. The two sides confronting each other in the Chrysanthemum night market didn't know who he was. The dusky night and the pair of eyes that were red from alcohol made it impossible for them to see Su Li's face clearly. More importantly, the military uniform he wore tonight didn't have a lieutenant colonel epaulette. It was for the sake of being low-key, but it was also a source of trouble. Thus, it was quite regrettable that Su Li's appearance became that point. "Who the fuck are you?" That major of the 2nd Military Region released a drunken burp. He looked at him from the corner of his eyes. His gaze then passed over his shoulder and landed on that group of Green Dragon Mountain soldiers. His expression suddenly changed. He roared with extreme excitement, "Brothers, go!" What was going on wasn't a person, nor was it a bullet, but a beer bottle. The government soldiers, who had experience in street fights, roared and threw the beer bottles in their hands towards the Chrysanthemum night market. For a moment, the night sky of Sunset Province was filled with the sound of whistling wind and the muffled sounds of beer bottles smashing into people or the ground. A few beer bottles intentionally or unintentionally flew towards Su Li's body. His expression was extremely ugly as he turned around. He completely protected Lulu's body in his arms and allowed those bottles to smash into his back. Bang 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 bang. It was as if the sound of drums could be heard. Chapter 478. Sulu turned around and used his sturdy back to block the beer bottles that filled the sky. He just happened to see the Green Dragon Mountain troops being attacked, only to see countless beer bottles raining down. The place was already in a mess. The dining tables were flipped over and the beer bottles shattered on the ground. The glass shards that flew up were like shrapnel, extremely dangerous. That Green Dragon Mountain military officer coldly stared over there, completely ignoring those dangerous beer bottles that flew past his head. With a bang sound, a beer bottle smashed into his head, creating a bloody wound that was so deep that the bone could be seen. The military officer expressionlessly took a deep breath, wiping away the blood on his face. Suddenly breaking the silence, he pointed over there and roared, "Fight for me!" The equipment of the Green Dragon Mountain troops was far behind the government army. Even if the Federation's Ministry of Defense provided a lot of support, they still looked pitifully plain. However, their military training and discipline far surpassed the average level of the government army. When those ferocious beer bottles flew over, they either threw themselves to the ground or lifted up the dining tables. They were extremely proficient in dodging. At this moment, hearing their commanding officer finally give the order to fight, the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers whose eyes were already burning with fire began to loudly shout. They picked up the stainless steel kettles beside them and fiercely threw them towards the government army, beginning a courageous counterattack. Whoosh! Whoosh! Several kettles whistled as they flew over. These kettles were not like beer bottles that could explode, but the stainless steel kettles that were filled with clear water were exceptionally heavy and sturdy, their momentum astonishing. Following that were even more stainless steel kettles. The giant hail-like kettles pierced through the night sky, landing in the middle of the 2nd Military Region's troops. With muffled smashing sounds, they instantly smashed into many people, causing them to bleed and faint on the ground. The ground was filled with remnants of chrysanthemums and foam. The color of the beer was the same. The sky was filled with beer bottles and stainless steel kettles. The entire chrysanthemum night market immediately sank into a dangerous chaotic battle, the number of people bleeding more and more. Both sides hid behind their respective tables, howling in pain and cursing at the same time. They fought at close quarters, picking up any hard objects around them and throwing them at each other. The scene was extremely spectacular. The rest of the customers in the night market had scattered like birds and beasts when the two sides confronted each other. Sulu tried to mediate but was trapped in the middle. There was a possibility that he would be accidentally injured by flying objects at any time. Fortunately, when the battle started, the night market waiter on the turntable was quick to react. He pulled the two of them into the turntable and at the same time, put a thick shield over their heads. From time to time there would be heavy banging sounds on the board. Sulu, who was frowning, held Lulu's hand and half squatted under the board. He was a little flustered by these sounds. However, the night market attendant seemed to be relatively calm. He squatted in the corner and drew circles silently. Sulu put down the phone and asked, "It looks like you're not that scared? We still have a lot of soldiers, so we have the most mountains in the army." Going back a few decades, there are so many old grudges between the few military regions that we can't even count them. Every time we drink too much and have nothing to do, we'll start complaining bitterly about which army abandoned their allies on the battlefield back then. And how brave we were, how could we not fight? The attendant said mockingly, "I heard the boss say that the chrysanthemum night market has been open for as long as these soldiers have been fighting for. Especially since last year, when the Federation started to counterattack, more and more soldiers came, and the number of battles became more and more frequent. Look, last week, the 3rd Red Division in the Westwoods even had a fight with a military region's special mecha team here. In the end, 3 ambulances even came." "That's really scary," Lulu said softly with a pale face. "What's so scary about it? When soldiers fight, they won't lay a hand on us commoners. Every time there's a loss, the officers of the army will naturally pay for it. All the facilities will be replaced every 2 to 3 weeks. The boss isn't that unhappy. As for us, we'll just treat it as a show," the male attendant said mockingly. He seemed to be indifferent, but in reality, his words were full of anger. After a moment he scratched his head and said emotionally, "But a scene like today's is really rare. Fuck, hundreds of beer bottles flying in the sky. It's really fucking spectacular." As he said that, the baffle above them was hit by a heavy object. With a heavy thud, dust fell. Hide! Hide! These bastards' kettles are too hard. Fuck you. Class 3, go to the warehouse and bring the stored beer bottles over. We don't have enough ammo. Save the kettles. There's not much left. Instructor, take people to the warehouse to get beer. Can't get beer? Get the charcoal for barbecue. 10:30 o'clock, 30 degrees inclination. 50 meters distance, smash it. Countless angry roars and orders came from below the baffle. The soldiers on both sides of the conflict were using everything they could to make tactical movements for airstrikes and avoiding airstrikes. Beer bottles whizzed over, stainless steel kettles blasted over, and then rocks picked up from the beach, primitive barbecue charcoal that hadn't been completely burned. At this moment, the density of airstrikes in the Chrysanthemum night market was abnormally terrifying. There was even a legendary scene of beer bottles and stainless steel kettles colliding in the air and perishing together. The three people below the baffle looked at each other. Sulu listened to these sounds and felt the chaos and danger outside. He felt like he wasn't in the Westwood's main planet, Sunset State, but still on the front line of the battlefield on Fallen Star. Above his head were the missile planes of the Federation and the Empire. Everywhere was filled with the smell of burning leaves and mushroom-shaped smoke. The chaotic battle had already begun. The night market was full of dangerous objects in the airstrikes. At this moment, facing the soldiers who had lost their minds, Sulu knew that he couldn't do anything. He helplessly took out a 37 brand cigarette and gave one to the male attendant. Lulu asked for one with trembling fingers. After lighting it up, she took a deep breath. Because of fear, her face became even paler. The three people crouched below the baffle and began to smoke silently. Just as he was about to finish his cigarette, the noise outside finally changed. It was a chaotic mess. Footsteps, the sound of fists hitting flesh, cries of pain and curses were incessant. Only the loud sounds of beer bottles and kettles were hard to hear. The airstrike alarm was lifted. Sulu put out the cigarette and carefully lifted the baffle to look outside. The night market was already in chaos. The two sides that were attacking from afar had finally gathered together and started to fight in close range. Chairs were smashed into pieces and cold iron pots were smashed into heads, causing blood to flow. Amidst the roars, the soldiers of the 2nd Military Region and the soldiers of the Green Dragon Mountain were entangled with each other in a fierce battle. Fortunately, the Federation's gun control was extremely strict. Even the frontline troops had to follow the rules and regulations of gun separation once they retreated to the main planet. Neither side carried a gun, so they could only vent their anger with their fists and feet. This fight looked tragic, but it shouldn't cause any deaths. Sulu temporarily relaxed. However, the situation immediately changed again. The Chrysanthemum Night Market was located in the bustling area of Sunset State. All around it were troops resting and reorganizing. The news of this fight between the government army and Green Dragon Mountain spread extremely quickly. Countless soldiers who came to watch the show flocked to the night market. The spectators who did not know the truth were easily stirred up by the intense scene before them. Not to mention, the grudge between the government army and Green Dragon Mountain had not been completely settled. The first to join the fight was a group of soldiers from the 2nd Military Region, who came after hearing the news. Then, a logistics company from Green Dragon Mountain also joined the fight. Then, some soldiers from the 1st Military Region couldn't watch anymore, and began to help a comrade in the trenches. A revolution was not a treat, but a fight really did feel like a treat. The two sides that were fighting fiercely in the night market did not shout and shout, but the passers-by excitedly joined in. The fight snowballed bigger and bigger, and the scene became even more chaotic. Every corner and space in the night market was filled with the shadows of fists and kicks. 2 versus 1 fight the landlord, 3 versus 1 was still fight the landlord, fighting until your head was broken and blood flowed. You could only look forward and not back. Both sides surrounded and blocked, cutting off the enemy's path of retreat. Sneak attacks, vicious attacks, blood flowing everywhere. The belt was not in the hands of the queen, only dancing in the night sky. Over 1,000 people fought in the night market. Countless pairs of feet crushed the golden chrysanthemums, and then crushed them together with the beer foam, glass shards, and mud on the ground, turning into some kind of indescribable mixture that splashed onto people's trousers and faces. Damn. This is really fucking spectacular. Su Li's head was still feeling tipsy. He groggily looked at this scene and said with incomparable shock. Then he thought, why hasn't the military police who received my call arrived yet? The chaotic battle in the night market was intense. The government army at the front lines always had a lot more people. Even if it was only the 2nd military region, they still had more people than Green Dragon Mountain. Not long after, the government army gradually gained the advantage and forced the other side to the northwest corner of the night market. The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers all had more or less injuries on their heads and bodies, but they were unwilling to admit defeat. They clenched their teeth and held on. The military police had not arrived yet, but the people of Group 7 had arrived first. When the members who were drinking and having fun in the Golden Resplendence heard that there was a big show happening not far away, no matter if it was the ruffian old members or the hedonistic and shameless new members, they all did not want to let go of this good opportunity to see a good show. They all excitedly rushed several dozen people over. The members of Group 7 were incomparably excited when they saw this scene. They did not care about the expressions of the people around them, and began to frivolously whistle. They even began to cheer for both sides. But suddenly someone remembered. Their manager seemed to have been drinking here before. Looking at the beer bottles on the ground in front of them, the night market was a mess, and there was not a single place that was undamaged. Everyone's expression changed and they began to worry. Although they all knew that Su Li's battle prowess was extremely ferocious, with over 1,000 drunken soldiers causing trouble, even if the war god himself was here, he would still have to avoid them. Who could really fight against 1,000 people? Xiong Linquan stared with wide eyes and searched for a long time, but he could not find any trace of Su Lu in this chaos. His phone call could not be connected either. His face immediately became as black as the bottom of a pot. Even someone as brave as him could not help but feel anxious when faced with this crazy night market brawl scene. He took a deep breath and painfully shouted, "Fuck!" Then he casually picked up a large iron pot in the mud by his feet, covered his head, and rushed into the night market. Chapter 479. We are here to look for someone. We are absolutely neutral. Don't accidentally hurt him. Because they were worried that their own supervisor, Su Lu, would be swallowed up by the sea of people, several dozen members of Group 7 gathered their courage and followed Xiong Linquan, who was spouting profanities, toward the center of the chaotic night market. Along the way, they picked up the small iron pots used for barbecuing that were scattered on the ground, or they picked up the table that was broken in two. They used them to block their heads and sides to protect themselves from the dangers that were everywhere. At the same time, they sincerely shouted out the words of self-defense like the one above. Right now, at the scene of the Chrysanthemum Night Market Brawl, the government army had already obtained a clear advantage. Those Green Dragon Mountain soldiers were suppressed to a corner of the night market. Group 7 squeezed out their sweaty bodies, accompanied by the slogan of not participating in the battle and a mess of protective equipment, actually successfully squeezed their way in. They approached the already messy food tray turntable that was full of octopus legs and mud. Beside the turntable, several government army officers were currently slapping the table, angrily commanding their subordinates to launch the final fierce attack on the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers that were still holed up in a corner but were still resisting with all their might. Their foreheads were still bleeding, clearly having suffered quite a bit in the previous chaotic battle. Xiong Linquan, who was wearing a large black pot, was sweating profusely. There were many muddy footprints on his body. While squeezing his way over, he still suffered a few kicks in the end. He moved close to the ear of a cursing officer and loudly said, brother, did you see our senior officer? Before you guys started fighting, he should have been drinking here." This officer's entire body reeked of alcohol, his tanned face completely red from anger and excitement. When he heard Xiong Linquan's loud question, he angrily turned his head and roared, "What are you yelling for? Didn't you see that we are about to win? Where did you see who?" Xiong Linquan couldn't find Su Lu, and his phone couldn't get through either. He was extremely worried, so how could he just let it go like this? He held onto his shoulder and said fawningly, "Brother, that is our senior officer. We don't dare let anything happen to him." Right at that time, there should be a beautiful girl by his side. The officer stared blankly for a moment, remembering the fellow who tried to calm the situation before. From his point of view, that guy's previous attitude was clearly biased towards the Azure Dragon Mountain, so he naturally wasn't in a good mood. He pulled Xiong Linquan's hand down and used his hand to cover his forehead that was constantly bleeding. He cursed, "Fuck. Is that busybody? If I didn't know, he might have been beaten to a pulp. I say, get out of my way. If you provoke me, I'll beat you." Hearing this, Xiong Linquan's expression changed slightly. The members of Group 7 behind him also glared at him. Over the past few years, Group 7 had made a name for itself in the Westwoods for being ruthless. After disbanding for a year, Group 7 was reorganized and welcomed Su Lu, a manager who dared to go against Du Shaoqing. He was even more arrogant and domineering than before, and it was deeply ingrained in his bones. Regardless of whether it was the new or old members, no one would be willing to tolerate this kind of attitude. Yan Bingyan glared with his bulging eyes. His arm, which was as thick as a tree trunk, stiffened as he raised his fist, which was as big as a bullet, and prepared to smash it. As the face of the 17th Division, he was extremely tall and sturdy. Now that he suddenly went berserk, his aura was extremely frightening. Unexpectedly, the moment he moved his fist, he was hugged by Xiong Linquan. Xiong Linquan was half a head shorter than him, but his strength was greater than his. "What? You want to go berserk?" That officer spat on the ground and cursed, "Fuck, you really think that I don't dare to beat up all of you? Fucking mercenaries." As old foxes in the army, they could easily determine the allegiance of the other party through their military uniform epaulets and aura. If it was in the past, Xiong Linquan would have long sent this officer in front of him flying with a kick. But right now he only tightly hugged Yan Bingyan, not letting him do anything. At the same time, he used his fierce gaze to suppress his restless subordinates. Right now, the situation in the Chrysanthemum Night Market was too chaotic. Everywhere were soldiers who had been stimulated by alcohol and blood to the point of near insanity. Although Group 7 was not afraid of fighting, their numbers were not small. More importantly, today's brawl involved Green Dragon Mountain. As an old member of Group 7 at this moment, Xiong Linquan calmly thought that if he and the others also participated in this brawl, perhaps it would bring some political trouble to Su Lu. Right now they had a black pot on their heads, but that did not mean that they really wanted to be the scapegoat. The most intense area of the brawl had already moved to a corner of the night market. The soldiers of Green Dragon Mountain clenched their teeth, unwilling to disperse or admit defeat. Their desperate postures stimulated the atmosphere of the scene to the extreme. Everyone involved gradually lost their last bit of rationality. Their eyes were red from killing, and from time to time, there would be miserable groans. Su Lu, who was squatting under the turntable, had already anxiously finished smoking 2 cigarettes. He watched the two sides of the brawl through the cracks. Some people began to pick up the sharp and broken beer bottles on the ground. He even saw that the weapons in the hands of some soldiers had traces of blood on them. He knew that the development of the situation had already spiraled out of control. He feared that before the military police arrived, someone would die. If an irresolvable and vicious conflict really did occur between the government army and Green Dragon Mountain, under the manipulation of certain people, it might affect the rare Great Reconciliation situation of the Federation. The ice-cold edge of the blade would be pointed at President Pabre and the high officials beside him. Moreover, it would definitely affect the military's victorious military operations against the Empire. Su Lu understood the balance between politics and the interests of the Federation on a large scale. However, the direct reason why he made such a risky decision and rushed to quell the situation first was only the blood in the night market and the possibility of death at any time. Regardless of the difference in ideology and political philosophy, regardless of how much blood was shed in the 4 states surrounded by S2, in the Westwoods region in the moment of war with the Empire, he believed that everyone's blood should flow on the front lines and should not dry up in the infighting and old grudges. After telling Lulu to stay under the turntable obediently with the waiter, Sulu crawled out from under the turntable. His whole body trembled and like a loach, he slipped past the excited and twisted faces of the soldiers. He arrived in front of Xiong Linquan and said in a deep voice, "Give me the gun." Xiong Linquan and his team members looked at him with surprise and excitement. They didn't know where he came from, but he didn't have a single injury on his body. Just as they were about to go up and pat him on the shoulder and leave, they suddenly heard these words and didn't react for a moment. The Federation strictly controlled firearms, and the army was no exception. In the entire Group 7, only Xiong Linquan, who loved guns as much as his life, had exchanged his military merits for a high-authority gun permit. He carried a gun on him at all times. Sulu knew this. With a calm face, he reached out his hand and directly took out a gun from Xiong Linquan's clothes. The slightly hot gun was a bit light in his hand. He frowned and looked down. He found that the gun was a green star, with an electric pulse and a liquid core at the back of the cartridge. The voice is a bit low, I'm afraid not many people can hear it. He thought in his heart and stuffed the green star back into Xiong Linquan's hand. Without any hesitation, he touched the gun again and found an H01 pistol. Finally satisfied, he held it tightly and walked toward the several officers of the government army. Xiong Linquan and his team members were stunned. They didn't know what he was going to do. Sulu walked in front of the several officers. Looking at their violent expressions, his heart sank. It was a nearly impossible task to calm nearly 1,000 soldiers who were driven crazy by violence and blood. You have already won. The military police will be here soon. Tell your people to stop. The leaders of the 2nd Military Region glanced at him and cursed, "Get out of my way." Sulu saw the blood and fighting on the other side. Without a moment of hesitation, he raised the pistol to the night sky and pulled the trigger continuously. Bang! 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 The H01 was the first generation of the H21. It also had a very long magazine, but it had the simplest mechanical firing pin design. The gunshot was exceptionally loud. He stared at the several officers of the government army and fired continuously into the sky with no expression on his face. His forearm kept trembling slightly, and the gun barrel spewed out beautiful gunfire. The crisp gunshot resounded throughout the chaotic night market, and then continued to rise, penetrating through countless environmental noises, and clearly shaking everyone's eardrums. Soldiers were the most sensitive to the sound of guns. The sudden series of crisp gunshots in the night market made them, who were fighting and roaring, subconsciously stop their movements at the same time. The beer bottle that was poking forward froze in the air, and the military boots that were kicking towards each other's abdomen lost most of their strength. At this moment, the uncontrollable chaos finally had an extremely precious moment of silence and the chaos of the night market. Many people from both sides started to look for the source of the gunshots. The people around Sulu clearly saw this scene, and they all rushed over. Sulu lowered his raised right hand, and in the midst of the smoke coming out of the gun barrel, he said to the officers in front of him expressionlessly, "Order your people to stop immediately." The members of Group 7 who squeezed into the night market saw this scene and felt the hostile gazes of countless people around them. With their eyes wide open, they rushed behind Sulu and stared fiercely at the surroundings, trying to intimidate the attacks that could erupt at any time towards Sulu. Because of the gun control, the soldiers in the night market basically didn't have any guns on them. However, the officer of the 2nd Military Region whose forehead was bleeding stared coldly at Sulu. He slowly pulled open a corner of his military uniform, revealing his gun holster, and said, "I also have a gun, but I haven't used it yet." The officer slowly took out his gun, scratched his forehead that was a little itchy from the stimulation of the blood, and looked at Sulu with disdain. "They said you're the officer, so you should know very well what it means to use a gun in a fight." In a group fight, using guns was a big taboo. This was the rule in the military for countless years. First, it was easy to kill with guns, and second, it was related to the dignity of a soldier. Sulu obviously knew this, but the problem was that in today's situation, if he didn't use his gun, there would definitely be people who would die. He wouldn't solve anything with this officer and the hostile government soldiers around him. He stepped forward, reached out, and twisted the officer's wrist. The tip of his elbow heavily hit the officer's armpit, and his left hand slid down from his wrist like a chain, easily snatching the gun, and then pointed the cold muzzle at the officer's forehead. Chapter 480. There were cries of alarm all around. Not a single person in the night market was able to clearly see what Sulu did to actually disarm him so easily. As a soldier, to have his gun taken away by someone empty-handed was an unparalleled humiliation. Moreover, the person who had his gun taken away was their commanding officer. The soldiers' shock immediately turned into boundless anger as they once again pressed forward. The members of Group 7 surrounding Sulu immediately felt the pressure become unbearable. Their expressions began to tense up. That officer was struck in the armpit by Sulu. He painfully covered his mouth and coughed a few times. However, he immediately straightened his body. His expression was extremely ugly as he stared at Sulu. With a voice that chilled to the bottom of one's bones, he said, "If you have the fucking guts, then kill me." Saying this officer valiantly took a step forward. Using the space between his eyebrows, he fiercely jabbed the barrel of the gun in Sulu's hand. "Don't worry about these guys. Brothers, let's first beat those mountain bumpkins to the ground. Then we'll take care of these mercenaries who sell their lives for money." The valiant officer looked at Sulu with ridicule in his eyes. He loudly cursed, "I want to see who the fuck dares to open fire today." Good. The situation that had already calmed down temporarily became even more agitated because of this officer's hot-blooded declaration. The government soldiers picked up their weapons and prepared to charge in that direction again. Meanwhile, the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers who were gasping for breath had no choice but to pick up the weapons beside them again. The soldiers completely ignored Sulu, who was holding a gun. With a whoosh, the crowd surged forward like a tide. Sulu slightly raised the H01 pistol in his right hand. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. With a whoosh, a bullet shot out. It brushed past the toes of the fastest charging soldier and shot into the ground of the night market. A wisp of green smoke rose. The soldiers who bravely charged into the battle with their weapons clearly did not have the slightest bit of mental preparation for this shot. Although Sulu's shot was 3 inches in front of his feet, the crisp sound of the gunshot and the dirt and smoke that sprayed out from the point of impact still shocked everyone on the spot. The other party actually dared to open fire. Moreover, he did it so cleanly without any hesitation. Where did he get the courage to do so? The sea of people paused for a second. Suddenly, a few extremely dangerous curses rang out from the crowd. "We have dozens of people. He only has a few bullets. Brothers, go." The current situation was still dangerous, to the extent where it was even more tense than before. It was just that the focus of the crowd's unconscious violent emotions had shifted from the Green Dragon Mountain troops to Sulu, as well as the several dozen Group 7 members behind him. Under the influence of alcohol, the soldiers who had fallen into a certain kind of crazy state of mind did not completely disregard life and death, but it was indeed difficult for them to rationally think about what would happen if they accidentally fired. More importantly, the soldiers did not believe that Sulu would dare to shoot at them. The crowd began to become restless. However, at this time the expressions of several officers changed drastically. They blocked in front of the crowd and spread out their arms, not allowing the crowd to touch a single hair on Sulu's head. Tonight, the guests of the 2nd Military Region's banquet were these officers. They came from the highly anticipated Iron 7 Division. Relying on their illustrious military achievements on the front lines of the Westwoods and the publicity of the Federation, they enjoyed extremely high prestige within the government army. No one would have thought that at this moment they would take the initiative to stand up. Although the soldiers did not know why they did this, they subconsciously slowed down their footsteps and watched the scene in front of them with puzzlement and hiccups. Sulu was now a celebrity in the Federation. However, thanks to the protection of the pair of sunglasses and the fact that he had never been interviewed by the media, even in the currently popular documentary Team 7, he had never shown his real face. Therefore, not many people could connect this simple and calm face at the scene of the night market fight with this legendary figure. However, the officers of the Iron 7 Division had seen him before. During the graduation drill at the training base, during the sniper operation at the Yellow Mountain Ridge on Planet 5460, this face had left a deep impression on them. It was a face that was too complicated for them to bear. As direct subordinates of Du Shaoqing, they should have hated Sulu very much. However, every time they thought of the black MX flying like a bullet in the valley, they felt a sense of closeness and gratitude in their hearts. However, the reason they stopped the restless soldiers was not to protect Su Li's safety. It was because they knew very well the true temperament of this young lieutenant colonel under his calm appearance. If these soldiers really dared to continue charging, this guy would really dare to shoot. At this time, the situation was slightly better. The sounds of fighting and cries of pain gradually subsided. However, the officer whose forehead was pointed at by Su Lu still stubbornly held his head high and looked at him with disdain. He was not moved by the sudden calm behind him. It seems that you are the highest-ranking officer here. I want you to order them to stop immediately, back off, and wait for the military police to investigate. Sulu lowered the barrel of his gun slightly and said calmly, "My brother died in Green Dragon Mountain." The officer said coldly, "But I don't want to explain anything to you mercenaries. You only need to know that I am a major. I should be the one giving you orders, not the other way around." "I am a lieutenant colonel," Sulu replied. The officer's expression changed slightly, but he still stubbornly refused to make any concessions. Su Li's face became slightly pale. His eyes narrowed out of habit, a stream of cool radiance flitting past. The current situation was extremely delicate. If he took a step back, he might be able to open up the sea and open the sky, but the night market definitely wouldn't be peaceful. No one could guarantee that the restless soldiers would clean up the Green Dragon Mountain troops that were already swaying left and right. This wasn't the front lines, but it was close to the front lines. Sulu silently thought to himself. His two thumbs pulled open the spring buckle on his pistol. Taking half a step back, he turned his body and aimed at this officer. Without any hesitation, he pulled the trigger. Pew-pew-pew. A series of concentrated and crisp gunshots rang out. Thick smoke and misty flames accompanied by a unique smell pervaded the space between the two people. The bullets sliced past, creating a series of sizzling noises. The unmanned turntable behind the officer was riddled with holes. Countless wood shavings flew into the air. Occasionally, shrapnel would strike metal objects, creating dang-dang sounds and light chirping sounds. It was unknown where it flew off to. Countless bullet points accompanied fine dust, appearing before everyone's eyes like a scene that could only be seen in movies. The stupefied soldiers stared at this scene in shock. Only when the gunshots stopped did they react. Their bloodshot eyes widened as if they were going to split apart. They began to shout loudly in anger, fear, and grief. The light smoke released from the gun barrels scattered. The soldiers who were preparing to pounce over and tear Sulu into countless pieces of minced meat discovered that their officer was still standing in his original position, completely unharmed. He stood in the middle of countless bullet holes. Only his face was pale as if he had just died. Sulu silently walked up. He raised the two pistols and pressed them against the officer's chest and neck. He forcefully pushed the officer against the turntable, creating a muffled boom sound. Amidst the sizzling sounds, the scalding hot gun barrels burned the officer's clothes, burning a circle of skin under his neck. The officer let out a muffled groan. His brows were tightly furrowed, but he did not cry out in pain. It was unknown whether he was stunned by the flurry of gunfire or because of some other reason. Sulu gazed at the face that was inches away from him and said, "I don't want to hear the story of the grudges between you and Green Dragon Mountain. After the people of the Empire are chased out of the Federation, it's your business how you want to take revenge. But before that, it's best if you keep your head clear." The officer's lips trembled, but he did not speak. "You should know very well how many bullets are left in these two guns. So, you must not overestimate my patience and rationality. I have never dealt with a commotion like this before. If you really push me into a corner, I'm willing to do all sorts of crazy things." Sulu finally said, "I know how ruthless you are, but you don't know how ruthless I am." The expression on the officer's face twitched slightly. He let out two hoarse laughs that sounded like he was crying. Then he lowered his head and was silent for a few seconds. He extended his right hand that had been cut by the wooden stubble and was dripping with blood. He waved at the crowd around him. When the soldiers in the night market saw this scene, they subconsciously and slowly put down the beer bottles and bayonets in their hands. Extremely complicated emotions appeared on their faces. The military police had not yet arrived. Sulu did not let go of the gun in his hand. Xiong Linquan and his team members stood behind him, vigilantly watching the surroundings. The officers of the Iron 7th Division also began to help maintain order. The night market gradually calmed down. The soldiers who had participated in the gang fight stood rooted to the ground like wooden puppets. Regarding the identity of the mercenary manager who had appeared out of nowhere and dared to shoot between the government forces and Green Dragon Mountain, there was a guess, or rather, a piece of information that gradually spread through the crowd. From time to time whispers could be heard. "It's the 7th Division? Then this is Sulu?" 3 minutes later, the mournful sound of a military vehicle alarm from the Westwoods Military Police Headquarters finally rang out outside the night market. "Why were you there? Shooting in the middle of the street. Do you know which military discipline this violated?" Regarding what happened tonight, first write a description of the situation. After the investigation team is formed tomorrow, I hope you can honestly answer your own questions. What's your name? Su. Lieutenant Colonel Sulu? Salute. In the dark interrogation room of the Westwoods Military Police Headquarters, the officers of the relevant departments were investigating the gang fight that night. Thus, there was a series of interrogations in front of them. What was very strange was that those cold and oppressive questions, when the officers saw Su Li's name, suddenly turned into shocked exclamations of disbelief. They subconsciously stood at attention and saluted the youngest lieutenant colonel of the Federation behind the table. Sulu looked at this scene and thought that if he had worn the epaulet today, would it have been easier to deal with the Chrysanthemum night market incident. What followed was a routine explanation of the situation and the recording of the witness testimony. However, the attitude of the military police officers at this time became much gentler. It didn't take long for this work to be successfully completed with Su Li's cooperation. "Lieutenant Colonel, I'm very sorry. Because this incident has too many implications, and people from all 3 military regions participated in the fight. We are also under a lot of pressure, so you can't return to camp for the time being. You may have to wait until tomorrow for the investigation team to formally question you before you can leave the military police headquarters." "No problem. We have arranged a lounge for you. Please follow me." Sulu followed an officer out of the door and walked upstairs. After asking, he found out that Xiong Linquan and his team members were resting on the 3rd floor and hadn't been punished, so he was relieved. However, he didn't expect that the girl named Lulu would also follow. The sound of footsteps was particularly clear in the dark military police headquarters building. When he walked past a door, he suddenly heard a somewhat familiar voice coming from behind the door. At this time, that voice was cursing. Immediately after, there were countless voices full of cursing behind the door. This is the conference room. Right now, sitting inside are the officers of the various military units who participated in the fight. The military police officer said with a self-deprecating smile, "They came to get people. Speaking of which, every one of them is a famous war hero." Encountering such people, the military police headquarters didn't dare to be too tough, so they could only let them hit the table. Chapter 481. No one died from the night market brawl, but many people from both sides were seriously injured and sent to the hospital. Since the matter was so big, the Westwoods Military Police Headquarters naturally launched an investigation extremely quickly. However, in response to this, the officers from various troops who came to the military police headquarters to rescue people or create a ruckus also arrived extremely quickly. The chaotic battle in the Chrysanthemum night market could not be sorted out for now. Just how many troops were involved, but from the noise of the people in the meeting room, it must have involved a lot of people. Other than the soldiers from both sides who were lying in the hospital, The rest of the people were all locked up in the military police department and a few temporary detention centers not far away. The government troops and Green Dragon Mountain troops were all under separate custody. Sulu stood outside the meeting room and listened silently. He originally thought that something had happened to the people of Green Dragon Mountain on the front lines, and as the liaison officer, sure Qinghai would come to deal with it. However, this somewhat familiar voice clearly did not belong to the hooligan young master. Who could it be? Fuck. I don't care so much. I only know that my people are still lying in the hospital right now, and there are still people locked up by you. When are you going to release them? You have to give me a definite answer. In the meeting room, an officer around 30 years old had a ruthless expression. He stared at the military police headquarters reception officer and slammed the hardwood long table with a bang. Accept my ass. Which night in Sunset State doesn't have dozens of fights? Does your military police headquarters have to send dozens of military vehicles to rescue people every time? Another officer sat by his side and stared at the military police headquarters officer with full anger. He took off his smelly military boots and slammed the table with force. He loudly said, "Didn't we just beat up a few monkeys in the mountain? Is there a need to make it like this?" "Exactly," the officer from before said with a gloomy face. "What political influence do you care about? I don't care. I just want to take my people back. The day after tomorrow our regiment is going to go to 3320, but you fucking locked up my electrical control officer. How do you want me to fight? Be blind? If we lose and people die, who's going to take responsibility? Do you have the right to take responsibility?" The third officer calmly continued to exert pressure on the military police headquarters. "This is a problem between the 2nd Military Region and Green Dragon Mountain to begin with. What does it have to do with our Hui Ming fleet? The 4 military officers who were caught by you were just on a normal vacation. They left Changfeng Base and saw the bustling night market. Therefore they were caught by you. Is there any justice in this? If you don't let them go, the warships won't be able to move. How will the Federation send soldiers to the front lines?" Hearing this, the officer who scolded the most fiercely at the beginning frowned and glared angrily. His name was He Lei, the commander of the 11th Automated Corps of the 2nd Military Region. He held the rank of lieutenant colonel and was the highest among the dozen or so officers present. However, the main force of the night market brawl was his subordinates. Now, more than 200 of them were detained by the Westwoods Military Police Headquarters. He had no choice but to come and rescue them. He was already embarrassed and angry. Now that he heard these words, he could not help but feel even more annoyed. He remembered that when he was in class back then, Mizuru was such a sinister and shameless rabbit. The chief of the Westwoods Military Police Headquarters, who was in charge of receiving the officers, had a very bad expression. He looked at the major of the Federal Fleet and thought, if your subordinates were really just watching, why would they be bruised and covered in blood? Although he thought so, the chief did not dare to ridicule the officers in the conference room, especially the ones who made the most trouble. These people were the mid-level powerful officers that the federal military focused on cultivating. They had made outstanding military achievements in the military operations in the past few months, and had grown into famous war heroes. At this time, the reason why these officers were far away from the front lines and appeared in Sunset State to rescue people for their respective troops was that they were going to participate in the frontline award ceremony in 3 days. How could the military police headquarters easily offend such people? Seeing that the section chief had no reaction, Lieutenant Colonel He Lei was furious. He slammed the table and said loudly, "I've already given enough face to the military police headquarters by not asking you to hand over the person since the monkeys of Green Dragon Mountain have already been beaten up badly. But if you still don't let him go, don't blame me for being reckless." Hearing this, the chief of the military police headquarters frowned and was about to reprimand him when he suddenly saw the officer beside him. He immediately shut up and thought, "You're familiar with them, so the headquarters urgently transferred you over to pacify them. Now is the time for you to take the field." Hua Xiaoxi was now the vice-captain of a mecha brigade in the Westwoods Military Police Headquarters. This time, he had returned to the main planet to rest and reorganize because he was going to participate in the award ceremony in 3 days. Who would have thought that when he was drinking soup at home, He would receive a call from his superior telling him to rush to the military police headquarters. Confused, he listened in the conference room for a long time before finally understanding the general situation. Although he did not understand the details, he could not listen any further. He looked at He and said angrily, "Enough, old He. The people from Green Dragon Mountain all had broken bones because of you. 2 of them are still lying in the medical cabin. You want to take your people away? How is that possible? What's the use of you making a ruckus in the military police headquarters? You have to at least give me some face, right?" "Hua Xiaoxi, I'm only slowly chatting with these military police officers because we're classmates." Lieutenant Colonel He looked at him coldly and said, "If this was somewhere else, I would have just dragged a regiment over and taken down this fucking military police building." Hua Xiaoxi's expression changed slightly. He was so angry that he laughed and said sharply, "Yes, who are you? You've already been promoted to regiment commander, Lieutenant Colonel. You've already caught up with the instructors, but you have the right to compete with me. Go. I'd like to see if you, the regiment commander, have the guts to drag your regiment over. But I still have to tell you that if your regiment wants to take down the military police building, I'm afraid it will be too difficult." "Is that so? Hua Xiaoxi, don't think that just because the West Woods is your home ground, you can be so impudent in front of me." He narrowed his eyes and looked at him. He slapped the table and said rudely, "I'm your squad leader. Don't fucking forget." Hua Xiaoxi's words stopped. His face was dark with anger, but he couldn't make any rebuttal to this sentence. After holding it in for a long time, he squeezed out a sentence from between his teeth. "I'll tell you the truth. Before the investigation is clear, it's impossible to let them go." The officer who had been hitting the table with his smelly military boots suddenly jumped up when he heard this. He pointed at Hua Xiaoxi's nose and scolded, "Which side are you on? Our military region has never treated the Westwoods military region as an outsider. My people are all experts in missile positioning and calculation. If you catch them, what will happen to the front line? Most of the people over there are from the Westwoods." Hua Xiaoxi glared at this thin and small officer. He wasn't afraid of him at all. He slapped the table and shouted back in an even louder voice, "You still have the nerve to say that? A few dignified professors from the Research Institute of Mechanization and Automation are fighting in the night market like fucking hooligans. Lin AI, you're also a talented student. Look at how you're holding your smelly shoes. What kind of shit have you fallen into? No wonder your subordinates are all fucking hooligans with high IQ but low EQ." With a buzz, the entire conference room was in an uproar again. The future of the federal military and the outstanding young officers no longer cared about face or manners. They slapped the table and scolded their mothers, smashed their teacups and scolded their fathers. Their obscenities shook the glass windows nonstop. This kind of high-spirited and fierce mood made the officers of the other troops also become agitated and join in the scolding battle. "If you don't give us an explanation for this matter, we'll beat up those monkeys from Green Dragon Mountain every time we see them in the future. Count me in. I've long found those bumpkins an eyesore. Let them go immediately. Severely punish those Green Dragon Mountain villains. And what's the background of that group of mercenaries? Fucking hell, they actually dared to shoot at my people. Let's not talk about anything else. You have to hand that guy over first." The tightly shut door of the meeting room was suddenly pushed open. Sulu walked straight in under the astonished gazes of the Silan officers behind him. His small eyes had long since narrowed into a line, or perhaps it would be better to say that they were a ray of light from a blade. His face was completely dark and extremely ugly. "I was the one who opened fire in the night market. How do you want to deal with me?" The conference room was suddenly in chaos and then gradually quieted down. Only the staff officer that Commander He brought along was still angrily scolding. This person was incomparably angry about what happened to his comrades. When he suddenly realized that Sulu had pushed open the door and walked in, admitting to what had happened, he glared at him and pointed at his nose and roared, "So it's you, kid? You've got guts to actually stand up. See how I'll cut you to pieces." After saying this, The staff officer suddenly felt that the environment around him was a little strange. He turned around in shock and saw that the conference room was deathly silent. The cigarette in his commander's mouth fell onto his military uniform, and a hint of fear flashed across his face. As for the officers who had been the most aggressive earlier, they began to use their trembling hands to fasten the collar buttons that they had undone after scolding him earlier. This strange scene made the staff officer's body a little stiff. His arm that was still pointing at Su Li's nose suddenly became much heavier. Commander He Lei slapped the back of his head fiercely. Then, in a fluster, he slapped away the burning cigarette butt on his military uniform and quickly pushed his chair away to stand up. Miss Liu Lin Ai Hua Xiaoxi and a few other young officers also hurriedly stood up. With unconcealable expressions of shock, they jogged in front of Su Lu. After the hurried formation was completed, Commander He Lei looked ahead and shouted loudly, "Salute!" With a whoosh, the officers collectively stood at attention. Their posture was impeccable. They raised their right hands in unison and saluted Su Lu. Then they shouted loudly, "Good morning, instructor." Time seemed to have returned to 10 months ago. In that secret training base of S1 in class in the middle of the mecha training field, when class monitor He Lei shouted, all the officers in the class saluted in unison. The iron-blooded instructor Tetrahue, who wore large sunglasses, nodded coldly. Only then did everyone dare to sit down. Su Li's eyes narrowed slightly. His expression was as cold as a block of black ice. He was originally a person as gentle as the spring sun. Even when he was dealing with that bunch of old soldiers from Group 7, he mainly acted in silence. But for some reason, when facing this batch of officer students with the most potential in the Federation, he was able to naturally put on an extremely cold expression. Perhaps it was because he was used to being their instructor and subconsciously wanted to maintain some sort of dignity as a teacher? The other officers in the meeting room who didn't know the inside story were all stunned. They didn't understand what had happened, but they could clearly feel the respect that He Lei and the others had for this young officer from the bottom of their hearts, and even fear. Su Lu didn't nod, so He Lei Hua Xiaoxi and the others didn't dare to disperse. They stood at attention and looked straight ahead. However, beads of sweat were dripping down their foreheads. You're tuning into the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.